Emily Carter's hands trembled as she approached the most dangerous man in the city with an absurd proposition: pretend to be her boyfriend at her ex-fiance's wedding. She'd been replaced, humiliated, reduced to nothing, and she had exactly one thing left to bargain with: a family heirloom, a desperate plan, and the kind of pride that wouldn't let her go quietly into the shadows. What she didn't know was that Adrian Moretti, the man whose empire was built on blood and fear, would see something in her broken eyes that reminded him of himself. And that terrified him more than any enemy ever could. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Emily's story travels. And if you want to know whether she survives the choice she's about to make, hit that like button and stay until the very end. The Crimson Lounge wasn't the kind of place where desperate women showed up uninvited. It was a fortress disguised as elegance: velvet booths, chandeliers that cost more than most people's homes, and a clientele that preferred their business conducted in whispers and shadows. The kind of establishment where everyone knew everyone, and strangers were either escorted in by someone with power or escorted out by men with guns. Emily Carter was neither. She stood just inside the entrance, her coat pulled tight against the November chill that still clung to her skin, aware of every pair of eyes that tracked her movement. The hostess, a woman with perfect posture and a smile that could freeze water, blocked her path with the efficiency of someone trained to spot people who didn't belong. "I'm sorry, miss, but this is a private club. Members only." Emily's throat went dry. She'd rehearsed this moment a dozen times on the subway ride over, but now that she was here, standing in front of the velvet rope that separated her old life from the one she was about to step into, the words felt ridiculous. "I need to speak with Adrian Moretti." The hostess's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Recognition. Warning. "Mr. Moretti doesn't take walk-ins." "I know." Emily's voice came out steadier than she felt. "But I have something he might want to hear." "I'm sure you do." The hostess's smile sharpened. "And I'm sure you can leave a message with his assistant like everyone else." Emily felt the moment slipping away from her, felt the familiar weight of being dismissed settling back onto her shoulders. She'd spent the last 3 months being invisible, at work, in her apartment, in the life she'd built with a man who'd decided she wasn't worth keeping. She was so goddamn tired of disappearing. "Tell him," she said, pulling the small velvet box from her coat pocket, "that I'm willing to trade." The hostess glanced at the box, then back at Emily's face. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then the woman lifted one perfectly manicured hand and gestured to someone Emily couldn't see. A man materialized from the shadows, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Emily's monthly rent. He didn't speak, just looked at her with the kind of assessment that made her feel like she was being cataloged and evaluated in real time. "She says she has something for Mr. Moretti," the hostess said. The man held out his hand. Emily hesitated, then placed the velvet box in his palm. He opened it with the same detached efficiency he'd used to approach her, examined the contents for exactly 3 seconds, then snapped it shut. "Wait here." He disappeared into the lounge's interior, taking Emily's last bargaining chip with him. She waited. The hostess returned to her station, ignoring Emily with the kind of practiced indifference that came from years of watching people beg for access to places they'd never belong. A couple emerged from deeper in the club, laughing about something Emily couldn't hear. They smelled like expensive cologne and old money. They didn't look at her once. Emily counted her heartbeats. 57 before the man returned. "He'll see you. 5 minutes." She followed him through a maze of corridors that seemed designed to disorient, past doors that probably led to rooms she didn't want to know about. The music from the main lounge faded, replaced by a silence that felt deliberate, heavy. The man stopped in front of a door that looked like all the others, knocked twice, and stepped aside. 5 minutes, he repeated. Emily's hand found the doorknob before her brain could catch up with all the reasons this was insane. She turned it, stepped through. The office was smaller than she'd expected, darker. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, but the lights were low enough that the skyline felt more like a painting than something real. A desk, 2 chairs, and a man sitting behind the desk who didn't look up when she entered, Adrian Moretti. Emily had seen his photo before. Everyone in the city had, even if they pretended otherwise. But photographs didn't capture the way he occupied space, the way the air seemed to shift around him. He was maybe 35, with dark hair that fell just slightly too long, sharp cheekbones, and the kind of face that would have been beautiful if it weren't so cold. He set down the velvet box she'd brought, pushed it across the desk toward her, and finally looked up. His eyes were gray. Not blue, not green, just gray, like concrete or storm clouds or something that had forgotten how to feel warmth. "You have 4 minutes left," he said. His voice was low, controlled, and completely devoid of interest. "Use them wisely." Emily sat down in the chair across from him without being invited. It was a small act of defiance, but she needed it. Needed to prove to herself that she could still move, still make decisions, still exist in spaces that told her she shouldn't. "My name is Emily Carter. 3 months ago, my fiancé, ex-fiancé, ended our engagement because his family arranged a marriage that made better political sense." She kept her eyes on Adrian's face, watching for any flicker of reaction. There was none. "The wedding is in 2 weeks. I received an invitation." "Congratulations." Adrian's tone suggested he'd heard more interesting stories from his dry cleaner. "I'm unclear on what this has to do with me. I need a date." That got a reaction. Not much. Just the slightest lift of one eyebrow, the kind of movement that could have been amusement or irritation or both. "You want me to attend a wedding with you? I want you to make it look like I've moved on. Like I wasn't destroyed by what happened. Like I'm not the pathetic woman they all think I am. And you thought the best way to accomplish this was to approach a complete stranger in a private lounge with a grandmother's ring and hope he'd say yes." Emily's cheeks burned, but she didn't look away. "I thought the best way was to approach someone who understands what it means to be underestimated. Someone who knows that sometimes the only way to survive is to make people believe a lie so convincing they can't tell the difference anymore." Something shifted in Adrian's expression. Not softening, he didn't seem capable of that, but a sharpening. Like she'd said something that caught his attention in a way the ring hadn't. "You know who I am," he said. Not a question. "I know enough." "Then you know I don't do favors for strangers who interrupt my evening." "I'm not asking for a favor, I'm offering a trade." Emily nodded toward the ring. "That belonged to my grandmother. It's worth at least 20,000, probably more. I'll give it to you in exchange for one night. Just one. You show up, you play the role, and when it's over, you never have to see me again." Adrian leaned back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made her want to squirm. She forced herself to stay still, to meet his gaze, to pretend she was the kind of person who could sit across from a man like him and not feel like she was drowning. "What makes you think I need a ring?" he asked finally. "Everyone needs something, even you. And what do you think I need, Miss Carter?" Emily hesitated. This was the moment where she could back out, apologize for wasting his time, take her grandmother's ring and whatever dignity she had left and leave. But she'd come this far. She'd crossed the threshold. She'd sat down in a chair no one had invited her to sit in. She might as well go all the way. "I think," she said slowly, "that you're a man who built an empire on making people believe things, making them afraid, making them respect you, making them think twice before they cross you." She paused. "I think you understand better than anyone that sometimes the most powerful weapon you have is the story people tell about you. And right now, I need a story. I need people to look at me and see someone who didn't just survive, someone who won." Adrian didn't move for a long moment. Then he picked up the ring box, opened it again, and examined the contents with more care than he had before. The ring itself was simple. Gold band, small sapphire, nothing ostentatious. The kind of thing someone kept because it meant something, not because it was worth anything. "This wedding," he said, still looking at the ring. "Where is it?" "The Belmont Estate. It's about an hour outside the city." "Who's the groom?" "Nathaniel Ashford." That got a reaction. Adrian's eyes flicked up from the ring, and for the first time she saw something that might have been genuine interest. "Senator Ashford's son." "Yes." "And you were engaged to him." "For 2 years." Adrian closed the ring box and set it down. When he looked at her again, it was with the kind of focus that made Emily feel like he was reading every secret she'd ever kept, every lie she'd ever told, every moment of weakness she'd ever tried to hide. "You're asking me to walk into a room full of politicians, socialites, and people with enough money to make problems disappear." he said. You're asking me to pretend to be in a relationship with someone I've never met. You're asking me to do this in 2 weeks, which means we'd have to be convincing enough that no one questions the timeline. And you're offering me a ring that, while sentimental, is worth less than I spent on lunch today. Emily's heart sank. Of course he'd say no. Of course this was ridiculous. Of course she'd made a mistake. I'll do it, Adrian said. Emily blinked. What? I'll do it. But not for the ring. He pushed the velvet box back across the desk toward her. You'll keep that. Consider it part of the performance. Then what do you want? Adrian stood, moving around the desk with the kind of controlled grace that suggested he was very good at violence and even better at hiding it. He stopped a few feet away from her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. 2 weeks, he said. You'll spend them with me. I'll teach you how to walk into that wedding like you belong there. How to speak. How to move. How to make everyone in that room believe that you didn't just move on, you traded up. By the time we're done, Nathaniel Ashford will look at you and wonder how he ever thought he could do better. Why would you do that? Something dark flickered across Adrian's face. Let's just say I understand what it's like to be underestimated. And I don't particularly like the Ashford family. He extended his hand. Do we have a deal? Emily looked at his hand, at the man attached to it, at the choice she was about to make. She'd come here with a desperate plan and a family heirloom. She'd expected rejection, maybe humiliation, possibly worse. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected him to say yes, hadn't expected the way her pulse quickened when he looked at her like she was a puzzle he wanted to solve. She should say no, should walk away, should go back to her quiet life and her quiet apartment and the quiet heartbreak she'd been nursing for 3 months. But Emily Carter was so goddamn tired of being quiet. She took his hand. Deal. Adrian's apartment, no penthouse, was everything Emily expected and nothing she was prepared for. It occupied the top 3 floors of a building that overlooked the river, all glass and steel and the kind of minimalist luxury that came from having enough money to strip away anything unnecessary. The walls were white, the furniture was black. The art was the kind that probably had names she wouldn't recognize and price tags that would make her nauseous. You'll stay here, Adrian said, leading her through a space that felt more like a museum than a home. The guest suite is on the 2nd floor, bedroom, bathroom, office. Everything you need. Emily stopped walking. I'm sorry, what? Adrian turned, his expression unchanged. If we're going to make this convincing, we need to work together. That means you'll be here every day for the next 2 weeks. It's easier if you just stay. I have a job and an apartment. Take time off or quit. I don't particularly care which. He continued down the hallway, clearly expecting her to follow. As for your apartment, you can keep it if it makes you feel better, but you won't have time to go back there. We have a lot of work to do. Emily felt something cold settle in her chest. You said you'd teach me how to be convincing. You didn't say anything about moving in. Adrian stopped at a door, opened it, and stepped aside. Miss Carter, you came to me with a problem. I'm offering a solution. If you'd prefer to show up at that wedding exactly as you are right now, angry, hurt, and so obviously trying not to fall apart that everyone will see it the moment you walk in, then by all means, go home. But if you want to walk in there and make Nathaniel Ashford regret every choice he's ever made, then you need to trust that I know what I'm doing. He wasn't wrong. Emily hated that he wasn't wrong. She stepped through the door into a room that was 3 times the size of her entire apartment. King-sized bed. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Attached bathroom that looked like it belonged in a spa. Everything was pristine, untouched, perfect. I'll have some clothes sent up for you tomorrow, Adrian said from the doorway. For now, get some rest. We start at 6. 6 in the morning? Do you have somewhere else to be? Emily turned to face him, to argue, to tell him that this was insane and she'd made a mistake and she wanted to go home. But Adrian was already gone. She stood alone in the guest suite, surrounded by luxury she'd never be able to afford, and tried to remember what her life had looked like 3 hours ago. Before the Crimson Lounge. Before the deal. Before she'd shaken hands with a man who looked at her like she was a problem he'd decided to solve. Her phone buzzed. A text from her best friend, Maya. How'd it go? Did he laugh you out of the building? Emily sat down on the edge of the bed and typed back. He said yes. The response came immediately. What? Details now. Emily started to type, then stopped. How did she explain this? How did she put into words that she'd just agreed to spend 2 weeks living with a stranger whose reputation was built on things she didn't want to think about too closely? That she'd traded one desperate situation for another, and now she was sitting in a penthouse that cost more than she'd earn in a lifetime, wondering what the hell she'd just done. She deleted her half-written message and sent something simpler. I'll call you tomorrow. It's complicated. She didn't wait for a response, just set her phone down, kicked off her shoes, and lay back on a bed that felt like sleeping on a cloud. The ceiling above her was smooth and white and empty. No cracks, no water stains, no signs of life. It was perfect. It was suffocating. She closed her eyes and tried not to think about Nathaniel, tried not to remember the way he'd looked at her when he ended their engagement, apologetic but firm, like he was doing her a favor by being honest. Tried not to hear his mother's voice on the phone 3 weeks later, kindly suggesting that Emily might want to move on with Grace instead of making things difficult. She'd received the wedding invitation 2 days after that call. Thick cardstock, gold lettering, her name printed in elegant script next to "and guest." The cruelty of it had stolen her breath. But now, lying in Adrian Moretti's guest suite with a deal that felt both like salvation and a trap, Emily felt something else entirely. She felt dangerous. 6 a.m. came too soon and too loud. Emily woke to the sound of someone knocking on her door, sharp, insistent, completely unapologetic about the hour. She dragged herself out of bed, still wearing yesterday's clothes, and opened the door to find a woman standing in the hallway. Not Adrian. A woman. She was maybe 50, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and the kind of posture that suggested she'd been trained by someone with a ruler and no patience for slouching. She looked Emily up and down once, her expression giving away absolutely nothing. "Mr. Moretti is waiting for you in the dining room," the woman said. "I'm Claudia. I manage the household. You have 15 minutes to make yourself presentable." She turned and walked away before Emily could respond. Emily stood in the doorway, still half asleep, trying to process what had just happened. Then she looked down at herself. Wrinkled shirt, yesterday's jeans, hair that probably looked like she'd fought with a tornado and lost, and scrambled toward the bathroom. 14 minutes later, she walked into the dining room wearing the same clothes, but at least looking like she'd attempted to shower and comb her hair. Adrian was already seated at a table that could have comfortably fit 12 people, reading something on his phone while drinking coffee from a cup that probably cost more than her security deposit. He glanced up when she entered. "You're late." "You said 6. It's 6:14. "I said 6. He set his phone down and gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." Emily sat, feeling like she'd been called into a principal's office. Claudia appeared from nowhere with a plate of food, eggs, toast, fruit that looked too perfect to be real, and set it in front of her without a word. "Eat," Adrian said. "I'm not hungry." "I don't care. You're going to need the energy." Emily picked up her fork more out of defiance than hunger and took a bite of eggs that tasted better than anything she'd made in the last year. Adrian watched her with the same intensity he'd used last night, like he was cataloging every movement, every expression, every micro-reaction she didn't know she was having. It was deeply unsettling. "Tell me about Nathaniel Ashford," he said finally. Emily set her fork down. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. How you met, how long you were together, what he liked, what you liked, why you chose someone else." The last question landed like a punch. Emily felt her chest tighten, felt all the carefully constructed walls she'd built start to crack. "His family needed a political alliance," she said, keeping her voice level. "I was a paralegal with student debt and no connections. The woman he's marrying is a congressman's daughter. It was a practical decision." "Practical," Adrian repeated. "That's the word he used?" "Among others." "And you believed him?" Emily looked up sharply. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means that men don't end 2-year relationships because of practicality. They end them because they want to. The political marriage was an excuse. I want to know what the real reason was." The words hit harder than they should have. Emily felt something ugly rising in her chest, anger maybe, or shame, or the kind of hurt that came from knowing someone was right about something you'd been trying not to think about. "He said I was too quiet," she said finally. "Too comfortable. He said being with me was like wearing the same pair of shoes every day. Perfectly fine, but nothing special. Nothing that made him want to wake up excited about what came next. Adrian's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. And you let him say that to you. What was I supposed to do? Argue? Tell him he was wrong? He wasn't wrong, Adrian. I am quiet. I am comfortable. I'm exactly the kind of person who fades into the background while people like him, people like you, take up all the space in the room. Then why are you here? The question caught her off guard. Emily opened her mouth, closed it, tried to find an answer that made sense. Because I'm tired of fading, she said quietly. I'm tired of being the person everyone forgets about. I'm tired of going to work and coming home and existing in this space between invisible and irrelevant. And maybe that makes me pathetic, showing up at a stranger's door with a grandmother's ring and a desperate plan. But at least I'm doing something. At least I'm trying. Adrian leaned back in his chair, studying her. Then he did something Emily didn't expect. He smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It wasn't warm or reassuring or any of the things smiles were supposed to be. It was sharp and cold, and somehow more genuine than anything else she'd seen from him. Good, he said. That's the first honest thing you've said since you walked in here. Now finish your breakfast. We have a lot of work to do. The next 2 weeks were the hardest of Emily's life. Adrian didn't teach her how to be convincing. He dismantled every habit, every gesture, every piece of armor she'd built, and forced her to rebuild from scratch. He started with the way she walked. You lead with your shoulders, he said on the first day, watching her cross the penthouse living room for the 10th time. You're apologizing for taking up space. Stop. I'm not apologizing for anything. You're hunched forward. Your steps are small. You're trying to make yourself smaller. I can see it from across the room. Emily straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and walked again. Better. Now do it again, and this time remember that you belong here. You're not asking permission to exist. You're not hoping someone will notice you. You're taking what's yours. She walked. Again and again and again until her feet hurt and her back ached and she wanted to scream at him to just let her sit down. But Adrian didn't let her stop. He watched every step, corrected every mistake, pushed her past the point where she thought she could keep going. And somehow, slowly, something started to change. By the end of the first week, Emily could walk across a room and command attention without saying a word. She could hold eye contact without flinching. She could stand next to Adrian, who was tall and imposing and took up space like it was his birthright, and not feel like she was shrinking. The second week, he moved on to conversation. People at that wedding will try to make you uncomfortable, Adrian said over dinner on the 8th day. They'll ask questions designed to embarrass you. They'll make comments that sound like compliments but are actually insults. You need to know how to deflect without looking defensive. How? Practice. I'll play Nathaniel's mother. Emily almost laughed. Almost. You're going to play his mother. Would you prefer I play Nathaniel himself? The thought of Adrian playing her ex-fiancé was so absurd that Emily did laugh. Fine. Be his mother. Adrian shifted in his seat, and somehow, impossibly, his entire demeanor changed. His posture softened. His expression took on a kind of practiced warmth that didn't reach his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was different, smoother, kinder. Emily, dear, it's so lovely to see you. I had no idea you'd moved on so quickly. You must tell me all about your new friend. The impression was so accurate that Emily felt her stomach drop. She'd heard that exact tone from Nathaniel's mother 100 times, the kind of sweetness that was really venom. He's not just a friend, Emily said, trying to keep her voice steady. We've been seeing each other for a while now. How wonderful. And what is it he does? I don't believe I've heard the name. Moretti, is it? Is he in finance? Emily hesitated. This was the part that terrified her. How did she explain what Adrian did without actually explaining what Adrian did? He's in business, she said carefully. Adrian, still in character, smiled. How lovely and vague. Well, I'm sure he's very successful if he can afford to be seen with you. You always did have a talent for finding men who could provide stability. The words landed exactly the way they were meant to, sharp and cutting and designed to make Emily feel small. But instead of shrinking, instead of letting the comment settle into her chest and fester, Emily did something different. She smiled. Actually, she said, her voice calm and clear, I think you'll find that I'm the one providing stability. Adrian's life can be quite chaotic. It's nice to have someone who keeps him grounded. Adrian dropped the character, his real smile returning, the sharp, cold one that suggested he was genuinely impressed. Better, he said. You took the insult and turned it into a compliment. Made yourself essential instead of decorative. That's what you need to do every time someone tries to diminish you. They practiced for hours. Adrian played everyone, Nathaniel's mother, his father, random guests, Nathaniel himself. He threw every possible scenario at her, every cutting comment, every backhanded compliment, every attempt to make her feel like she didn't belong. And Emily learned to fight back. Not with anger, not with defensiveness, but with the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing she'd survived worse than anything these people could throw at her. By the time the wedding was 3 days away, Emily barely recognized herself. She stood in front of the mirror in her guest suite, wearing a dress Adrian had commissioned for the occasion, midnight blue silk that fit like it had been designed specifically for her body, and saw someone different, someone who stood taller, someone who didn't apologize for taking up space, someone who looked like she belonged next to a man like Adrian Moretti. "You're ready," Adrian said from the doorway. Emily turned. He was wearing a tuxedo, perfectly tailored, looking like he'd stepped out of a magazine spread about men who ran empires. But it was his expression that caught her attention, something almost soft in his eyes, something that looked like pride. "Are you sure?" she asked. "I'm sure." He crossed the room, stopped in front of her, and adjusted the necklace she was wearing, a simple gold chain with a pendant that matched the ring she'd tried to give him. "Emily, look at me." She did. "When you walk into that wedding," Adrian said quietly, "everyone in that room is going to see what I see. Not the woman Nathaniel Ashford discarded, not someone who's trying to prove something. They're going to see someone who already won." Emily's breath caught. "How do you know?" "Because I've spent 2 weeks watching you become her." He stepped back, and the moment passed, replaced by the familiar distance Adrian always maintained. But Emily felt something shift, something dangerous and terrifying and real. She was falling for him, not for the performance, not for the protection or the transformation or the way he'd taught her to command a room. She was falling for the man who saw her when she was invisible, who pushed her when she wanted to quit, who believed she could be someone different when she didn't believe it herself. And that was a problem, because in 3 days she'd walk into Nathaniel Ashford's wedding on Adrian Moretti's arm, play the role they'd practiced, and then it would be over. The deal would be done. Adrian would go back to his empire, and Emily would go back to being exactly who she was before, except now she'd know what it felt like to be someone else. Someone stronger, someone braver, someone who didn't belong to her. "The car leaves at 3, Adrian said, already moving toward the door. "Don't be late." He left before she could respond. Emily turned back to the mirror and studied the woman looking back at her. The dress, the posture, the confidence she'd learned to wear like armor. She'd asked Adrian to teach her how to survive his world. What she hadn't expected was how much it would cost her to leave it. The morning of the wedding arrived with the kind of gray sky that threatened rain but never quite delivered. Emily woke up before her alarm, her stomach already twisting itself into knots that had nothing to do with breakfast, and everything to do with the fact that in approximately 6 hours she'd be walking into the Belmont estate on Adrian Moretti's arm. She stared at the ceiling of her guest suite, still pristine, still perfect, still feeling like somewhere she was borrowing rather than inhabiting, and tried to remember how to breathe normally. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from Maya. "Today's the day. You've got this. Call me after and tell me everything." Emily typed back a thumbs-up emoji because actual words felt impossible right now, then dragged herself out of bed and into the shower. The water was too hot, but she didn't adjust it. The scalding heat felt like the only real thing in a morning that already seemed dreamlike and surreal. When she emerged 20 minutes later, wrapped in a towel that was softer than anything she owned, Claudia was waiting in the bedroom with a garment bag and an expression that suggested punctuality was a virtue, and Emily was testing her patience. "Mister, Moretti wants you downstairs in 30 minutes, Claudia said, hanging the garment bag on the closet door. "Hair and makeup will be here in 10. I can do my own. Mr. Moretti insists." Of course he did. Emily spent the next 3 hours being transformed by people who didn't speak to her beyond necessary instructions. The hairstylist worked in silence, twisting Emily's dark hair into something elegant and intricate that probably had a French name she'd never remember. The makeup artist was more talkative, but only about color palettes and undertones and whether Emily's skin was more cool or warm. No one asked how she was feeling. No one asked if she was nervous. No one seemed to care that beneath all the silk and powder and carefully applied mascara, Emily felt like she was about to walk off a cliff. By the time they finished, she barely recognized her reflection. The woman in the mirror looked expensive, controlled, like someone who attended political weddings and socialized with senators and didn't spend her weekdays filing paperwork in a law office that smelled like burnt coffee and broken dreams. The midnight blue dress fit exactly the way Adrian said it would, like it had been made for her body specifically, which it probably had been. The neckline was elegant without being suggestive. The fabric moved like water when she turned, and the whole effect was understated in a way that probably cost more than her car. She was still staring at herself when Adrian appeared in the doorway behind her, his reflection joining hers in the mirror. He'd changed since breakfast. The casual clothes he'd worn earlier were gone, replaced by a charcoal gray suit that looked like it had been cut by someone who understood that clothes were armor and presentation was warfare. His dark hair was pushed back from his face, his jaw was clean-shaven, and when his eyes met hers in the mirror, Emily felt something electric run down her spine. "You look perfect," he said. "I look terrified." "That too." He stepped into the room, closing the distance between them until he was close enough that she could smell his cologne, something dark and woody that probably had a name like Obsession or Danger or Rich Bastard. "But they won't see that. They'll see exactly what we want them to see." Emily turned to face him. "What if I mess this up?" "You won't. You don't know that." "I do." Adrian reached out and adjusted the pendant around her neck, the same gesture he'd made 3 days ago, but somehow more intimate now. His fingers brushed her collarbone and Emily's breath caught. "Emily, look at me." She did. "You've spent 2 weeks learning how to do this," Adrian said, his voice low and steady. "You know how to walk into that room. You know how to talk to these people. You know how to make Nathaniel Ashford regret every decision that led him away from you. The only thing you need to do now is remember that you're not pretending to be someone else. You're remembering who you've always been underneath all the doubt." "And who's that?" "Someone who doesn't need him anymore." The words settled into Emily's chest like a key turning in a lock. She wanted to believe them, wanted to believe that the woman in the mirror was real, that the confidence she'd learned wasn't just borrowed armor. She'd have to return when this was over. But standing this close to Adrian, feeling the weight of his attention like a physical thing, Emily wasn't sure what she believed anymore. "The car's waiting," Adrian said, stepping back and breaking whatever spell had been building between them. "Are you ready?" "No, not even remotely." "Yes," Emily lied. The drive to the Belmont estate took just over an hour, and Emily spent most of it staring out the window while Adrian made phone calls in a language she was pretty sure was Italian. He spoke quietly, his tone clipped and businesslike, and Emily tried not to think about what kind of business required that level of discretion. She'd done a decent job over the past 2 weeks of not asking questions about Adrian's life. Not because she didn't want to know, curiosity was a constant hum in the back of her mind, but because part of her understood that knowing too much would make it harder to walk away when this was over. And she would have to walk away. That was the deal. The estate appeared around a curve in the road like something out of a period drama. Sprawling grounds, manicured gardens, a mansion that looked like it had been imported brick by brick from some European countryside. Cars lined the circular driveway, all of them expensive, all of them gleaming in the late afternoon light that had finally broken through the clouds. Emily's hands started shaking. Adrian ended his call and looked at her. "Breathe." "I am breathing." "No, you're hyperventilating. There's a difference." He reached across the seat and took her hand, the first time he'd initiated physical contact that wasn't part of training or demonstration. His palm was warm, his grip firm without being controlling. "Emily, we're going to walk in there together. We're going to make an appearance. We're going to let people see exactly what they need to see. And then we're going to leave. That's it. Nothing more complicated than that." "What if someone asks about us? About how we met?" "Then we tell them the truth." Emily stared at him. "The truth?" "Not the whole truth, just the parts that matter." Adrian's thumb brushed across her knuckles in what might have been a conscious gesture of comfort or might have been completely unconscious. We met through mutual acquaintances. We've been seeing each other for a few months. We prefer to keep our private life private. If anyone pushes for more, we deflect. You've practiced this. Well, practicing in your living room is different than doing it in front of people who want to see me fail. Then don't fail. The simplicity of it was almost funny. Don't fail. As if she could just decide not to fall apart, not to let the weight of Nathaniel's rejection crush her, not to feel like an imposter playing dress-up in someone else's life. But Adrian was still holding her hand, still looking at her like he believed she could do this, and Emily found herself nodding. "Okay," she said. "Okay." The driver opened the door. Adrian got out first, then turned and offered Emily his hand. She took it, letting him help her out of the car, even though she didn't need the assistance. It was part of the performance, part of the illusion they were selling, or at least that's what she told herself. The entrance to the estate was crowded with guests in expensive clothes exchanging air kisses and compliments that sounded genuine but probably weren't. Emily recognized a few faces from events she'd attended with Nathaniel, political fundraisers, charity galas, the kind of parties where everyone smiled and no one said anything real. She felt their attention shift the moment she and Adrian started up the steps. It wasn't subtle. Conversations paused mid-sentence, heads turned. Someone whispered something to someone else, and suddenly Emily was aware of every eye tracking their movement, cataloging every detail, forming opinions and judgments before she'd even made it through the door. Her instinct was to shrink, to hunch her shoulders, drop her gaze, make herself smaller. Instead, she straightened her spine and kept her hand in Adrian's. They walked through the entrance together, and Emily felt the shift in energy like a physical wave. People stared. People whispered. And then someone Emily recognized from Nathaniel's family, an aunt maybe, or a distant cousin, approached with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Emily, what a lovely surprise. We didn't realize you'd be attending." The implication was clear. You weren't supposed to come. You were supposed to stay home and lick your wounds like a good rejected fiancé. Emily returned the smile with one of her own. "I wouldn't miss it. Nathaniel and I may not be together anymore, but I still wish him well." The woman's gaze slid to Adrian with barely concealed curiosity. "And who's this?" "Adrian Moretti, he said, extending his hand with the kind of easy confidence that suggested he'd been doing this his entire life. "It's a pleasure." The woman shook his hand, her expression shifting from curiosity to something more cautious. "Moretti, that name sounds familiar. I get that a lot. And how do you and Emily know each other?" "Through mutual friends," Emily said smoothly, exactly as she'd practiced. "We met a few months ago." "How wonderful. Well, I'm sure we'll see you both inside. The ceremony starts in 20 minutes. She walked away before Emily could respond, already turning to whisper something to the person next to her. Emily exhaled slowly. "That wasn't so bad. That was the easy part," Adrian said quietly. "The real test comes when you see him." "Nathaniel." Emily had been trying not to think about that moment, had been trying not to imagine what it would feel like to see him again after 3 months of silence, what he'd look like, what he'd say, whether he'd acknowledge her at all or pretend she didn't exist the way he'd done for most of their engagement. They moved into the main hall, which had been transformed into something out of a wedding magazine. Flowers everywhere, white chairs arranged in perfect rows, enough candles to constitute a fire hazard. Guests were already taking their seats, still talking in hushed voices that somehow managed to carry across the entire space. Emily and Adrian found seats near the back, not too close to the front where they'd draw attention, but not so far back that it looked like they were hiding. Strategic positioning. Another thing Adrian had taught her. The ceremony started exactly on time. Music played. Bridesmaids walked down the aisle in matching lavender dresses. And then Nathaniel appeared at the front of the room, looking exactly the way Emily remembered. Tall, handsome in a generic sort of way, with blonde hair and blue eyes, and the kind of smile that probably worked on voters and donors and anyone who didn't know him well enough to see through it. He was smiling now, watching the aisle, waiting for his bride. Emily felt something twist in her chest. Not heartbreak. She'd already done that part. This was something different, smaller, like looking at a photograph of someone you used to know and barely recognizing them. The bride appeared, and the room did that collective inhale thing that rooms always did at weddings. She was beautiful in the way political daughters were always beautiful, polished, appropriate, wearing a dress that probably cost more than Emily's student loans. She walked down the aisle with perfect posture, her smile never wavering, and when she reached Nathaniel, he took her hand like he'd been waiting his whole life for this moment. Maybe he had been. Adrian's hand found Emily's under the cover of her dress, his fingers threading through hers in a gesture that was becoming familiar, comforting, real. She squeezed back. The ceremony was exactly what Emily expected. Traditional, boring, full of words about love and commitment that sounded nice but meant nothing coming from two people who'd agreed to marry for political convenience rather than actual feeling. The officiant talked about partnership and dedication and choosing each other every day, and Emily wondered if Nathaniel and his bride had actually chosen each other, or if the choice had been made for them by parents and advisors and people who cared more about appearances than happiness. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, the room went silent in that way that suggested everyone was thinking about it, but no one was stupid enough to actually speak up. Emily kept her mouth shut. 20 minutes later, it was over. Nathaniel kissed his bride. Everyone applauded, and the newly married couple walked back down the aisle together while a string quartet played something Emily vaguely recognized from a movie she'd seen years ago. Nathaniel's eyes found hers as he passed their row. For a split second, everything stopped. He saw her, saw Adrian next to her, saw the way Emily was sitting, straight-backed, composed, not falling apart the way he probably expected. His expression flickered, surprise maybe, or recognition, or something else Emily couldn't quite name, and then he was past them, moving toward the reception, already smiling at someone else. Emily realized she'd been holding her breath. "You okay?" Adrian murmured. "I don't know yet." The reception was held in a ballroom that made the ceremony space look modest by comparison. Crystal chandeliers, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gardens, tables set with china that probably cost more per plate than Emily made in a week. Everything was white and gold and designed to remind you that the people hosting this event had more money than you'd ever see in your lifetime. Emily and Adrian were seated at a table near the edge of the room, far enough from the head table that they wouldn't be subjected to speeches up close, but still visible enough that people would notice them. Strategic positioning again. Everything with Adrian was strategic. The other people at their table were strangers, donors probably, or business associates, people who smiled politely but didn't engage in actual conversation beyond surface-level pleasantries. Emily was grateful for it. She didn't have the energy to perform more than necessary. Dinner was served in courses that kept appearing without anyone seeming to order them. Emily picked at her food, too aware of her own pulse, too conscious of the fact that every few minutes someone at another table would glance over at her and Adrian and whisper something to their companion. "They're staring," she said quietly. "Let them." Adrian took a sip of wine, completely unbothered. "That's the point." I thought the point was to show Nathaniel I'd moved on." "It is. And part of moving on is letting people be curious, letting them wonder who you are now, who I am, what we're doing together." He set his glass down and looked at her directly. "You want to know what they're thinking?" "I'm not sure I do." "They're thinking that you look different, that you're with someone they don't recognize, that maybe they underestimated you." His voice was low enough that only she could hear. "They're thinking that Nathaniel Ashford might have made a mistake." Emily wanted to believe that. Wanted to believe that the whispers were about her transformation instead of her audacity in showing up at all. But she'd spent too many years being invisible to trust that people were actually seeing her now. The dancing started after dinner. The bride and groom had their first dance, perfectly choreographed, probably rehearsed a dozen times. And then the floor opened up to everyone else. Music filled the ballroom, couples moved together, and Emily watched from the safety of their table, trying to ignore the fact that her hands were shaking again. Adrian stood and offered her his hand. "Dance with me." It wasn't a question. Emily looked up at him, at this man who'd spent 2 weeks teaching her how to be someone else, and felt panic rise in her throat. "I don't think we practiced this. We practiced in your living room. And now we're practicing in a ballroom full of people who are expecting us to look like a couple. So dance with me." Emily took his hand because refusing would have drawn more attention than accepting. Adrian led her onto the floor with the same controlled grace he brought to everything else, positioning them somewhere in the middle of the crowd where they were visible but not conspicuous. His hand settled on her waist. Hers rested on his shoulder. And then they were moving, swaying to music Emily barely heard over the sound of her own heartbeat. "You're tense," Adrian said. "I'm terrified." "Of dancing? Of all of this? Of being here? Of everyone watching us? Of—" She stopped herself before she could finish the sentence. "Of falling for you. Of forgetting this isn't real." Adrian pulled her slightly closer, closing the distance between them until they were close enough that Emily could feel the warmth of his body through the thin fabric of her dress. "Do you know what I see when I look at you right now? Someone pretending to be confident? Someone who stopped pretending about 3 days ago." His voice was quiet, intimate in a way that made her skin feel too tight. "You keep waiting for permission to be the person you've become, Emily. But no one's going to give it to you. You just have to take it." Before Emily could respond, she caught movement in her peripheral vision. Nathaniel and his bride were dancing nearby, close enough that Emily could hear them talking if she wanted to. She didn't want to, but Nathaniel's eyes found hers anyway, holding her gaze for a beat longer than necessary before he looked away. "He's watching you," Adrian murmured. "I know." "How does it feel?" Emily considered the question. A month ago, the answer would have been devastating, would have shredded whatever remained of her pride and left her bleeding in the middle of this perfect ballroom. But now, standing in Adrian's arms, wearing a dress that cost more than her rent, she felt something different. She felt nothing. Not vindication, not satisfaction, not even anger, just nothing. "It feels like he's a stranger," she said finally. Adrian's hand tightened on her waist, just slightly. "Good." They danced through 2 more songs before Emily needed air. She excused herself and made her way toward the terrace doors, slipping outside into the cool evening that had finally decided to commit to being autumn. The gardens were lit with string lights and paper lanterns, creating pockets of warmth in the gathering darkness. She was alone for maybe 30 seconds before someone joined her, not Adrian. Emily. She turned and found herself face to face with Nathaniel for the first time in 3 months. He looked the same, sounded the same, even smiled the same smile he'd given her 1,000 times during their engagement, warm but not quite reaching his eyes, genuine but carefully measured. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. Emily forced herself to hold his gaze. "You invited me." "I know, I thought you might not want to." "Why wouldn't I want to come?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "Emily, I ended our engagement. I married someone else. Most people in your position would have declined." "I'm not most people." "No." His gaze flicked back toward the ballroom, toward wherever his bride had disappeared to. "No, you're not. You look different." "Thank you." That wasn't necessarily a compliment. Emily felt something cold settle in her stomach. Then what was it? Nathaniel stepped closer, lowering his voice. "It was an observation. You show up here with some guy no one's ever heard of, wearing a dress that probably costs more than you make in 6 months, acting like you didn't spend 2 years of your life planning a future with me. It's concerning." "Concerning?" "Yes. I worry about you, Em. I don't want to see you make decisions you'll regret just because you're hurt." The nickname, Em, the one he'd called her throughout their relationship, landed like a slap. Emily had forgotten how condescending he could sound when he thought he was being kind, how he'd perfected the art of making concern sound like criticism. "I appreciate your worry," Emily said, keeping her voice level. "But I'm fine. Better than fine, actually." "Are you?" "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're trying very hard to prove something. And I just want to make sure you're not getting involved in something dangerous." "Dangerous?" "Adrian Moretti." Nathaniel said the name like it tasted wrong. "Do you know who he is? What he does?" "I know exactly who he is." "Then you know he's not the kind of man you should be with. Emily, you're a paralegal. You work in family law. You're not equipped to handle someone like that." The words were so perfectly Nathaniel, so convinced of his own rightness, so certain that he knew what was best for her, that Emily almost laughed. This was the man she'd loved, the man she'd planned to marry. And he was standing in front of her on his wedding day, telling her she wasn't capable of making her own decisions. "You're right," Emily said quietly. "I'm not equipped to handle someone like Adrian, but maybe that's the point. Maybe I spent 2 years being exactly the person you thought I should be. Quiet, comfortable, perfectly fine. And it got me nowhere. So now I'm trying something different. I'm choosing something different. And whether you approve or not really isn't my concern anymore. Nathaniel's expression hardened. I'm trying to help you. No, you're trying to make yourself feel better about the fact that I didn't fall apart when you left. You wanted me to be devastated. You wanted me to stay home and cry and prove that losing you was the worst thing that ever happened to me. Emily took a step closer, holding his gaze. But I didn't. I'm here, I'm fine, and that bothers you more than you want to admit. That's not, it is. And you know what? I'm grateful for it, because if you hadn't ended our engagement, I never would have realized how small I'd made myself to fit into your life. How much I'd given up to be what you wanted instead of who I actually am. So thank you, Nathaniel. Thank you for choosing someone else. You did me a favor. She turned to walk away, but Nathaniel caught her arm. Emily, wait. Let go of her. Adrian's voice cut through the night air like a blade. He'd appeared from nowhere, moving with the kind of speed that suggested he'd been watching the entire exchange. His hand closed around Nathaniel's wrist, not violently, but with enough pressure that Nathaniel immediately released Emily's arm. We were just talking, Nathaniel said, trying to maintain his composure even though he'd gone slightly pale. And now you're done. Adrian didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. The threat was implicit in every syllable, in the way he positioned himself between Emily and Nathaniel, in the cold calculation of his expression. You should get back to your bride. I'm sure she's wondering where you disappeared to. Nathaniel looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Adrian's eyes, something dark and dangerous and completely serious, made him reconsider. He stepped back, straightened his jacket, and forced a smile that looked painful. Enjoy the rest of your evening, he said, directing the words at Emily even though he was already backing away. Both of you. He disappeared into the ballroom, and Emily felt her legs go weak. Adrian caught her before she could stumble, his hand steady on her arms. Are you hurt? He asked. No, I'm fine. He just startled me. He grabbed you. He didn't mean, I don't care what he meant. Adrian's voice was still low, still controlled, but there was an edge to it now that Emily had never heard before. Something protective and possessive and absolutely deadly. No one touches you without your permission, ever. Emily looked up at him, at this man who'd agreed to a ridiculous arrangement with a stranger and somehow turned it into something that felt real, and felt her carefully constructed walls start to crumble. Adrian, we're leaving. What? The reception isn't even... I don't give a damn about the reception. You came. You showed them you'd moved on. You looked Nathaniel Ashford in the eye and told him exactly what he needed to hear. Mission accomplished. He took her hand, already moving toward the exit. Now we're leaving before I do something that will make tomorrow's headlines. Emily didn't argue. She let Adrian lead her back through the ballroom, past the guests who were too drunk or too distracted to notice their departure, past the elaborate decorations and the carefully constructed illusion of happiness. They made it to the car in under 5 minutes, and by the time the driver pulled away from the Belmont estate, Emily could breathe again. She looked back through the rear window at the mansion growing smaller behind them, at the lights and the music and the life she'd almost had, and felt the last thread connecting her to Nathaniel Ashford finally snap. It was done. It was over. She'd survived. Adrian was on his phone again, speaking in that same quiet Italian, his tone clipped and businesslike. Emily watched him in the darkness of the car, memorizing the sharp angles of his face, the way his jaw tensed when he was listening to something he didn't like, the controlled violence he carried in every movement. This was the real Adrian Moretti, not the patient teacher who'd spent 2 weeks transforming her, not the polite date who danced with her in a ballroom full of strangers. This was the man who built empires out of fear and loyalty and calculated risk. And Emily had agreed to walk into his world for one night. Except it didn't feel like one night anymore. It felt like she'd crossed a threshold she couldn't uncross, made a choice she couldn't unmake. She'd asked Adrian to teach her how to survive, and he had. But what she hadn't anticipated was that surviving his world meant becoming someone who didn't fit in her old one anymore. The car pulled up in front of Adrian's building 30 minutes later. He ended his call and turned to her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Thank you. Emily said quietly. For everything, for doing this, for don't thank me yet. Something in his tone made Emily's pulse quicken. What do you mean? Adrian looked at her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes. Then he opened the car door and stepped out, offering his hand to help her. Come inside, he said. We need to talk. Emily's hands were still trembling when they stepped into the elevator. She kept them clasped in front of her, watching the numbers climb toward the penthouse, acutely aware of Adrian standing beside her in silence. The air between them felt different now, charged with something that hadn't been there 2 hours ago when they'd left for the wedding. Or maybe it had always been there, and Emily had just been too focused on surviving to notice. The elevator doors opened directly into Adrian's penthouse. He walked in ahead of her, already pulling off his jacket and tossing it over the back of a chair with none of the care someone should show for something that probably cost $5,000. Emily followed more slowly, suddenly unsure of what to do with herself in this space that had become familiar but never quite felt like home. Drink? Adrian asked, moving toward the bar without waiting for an answer. I probably shouldn't. That wasn't really a question. He poured 2 glasses of something amber and expensive looking, then crossed the room and handed one to her. Sit down before you fall down. Emily sank onto the edge of the sofa, grateful for permission to stop pretending she was fine. Her feet hurt from the heels she'd been wearing for 6 hours. Her scalp ached from the pins holding her hair in place. And somewhere underneath all the physical discomfort was an exhaustion that had nothing to do with her body and everything to do with the fact that she'd just spent an evening watching her ex-fiancé marry someone else while pretending she didn't care. She took a sip of the drink Adrian had given her. It burned going down, but in a good way. Grounding. Adrian remained standing, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city sprawling below them. He'd loosened his tie at some point, unbuttoned the top button of his shirt, and Emily found herself staring at the exposed line of his throat before she caught herself and looked away. You did well tonight, he said without turning around. I didn't do anything except stand there and try not to panic. You faced the man who destroyed you and told him you'd moved on. You danced in front of a room full of people who expected you to fail. You held your head up when every instinct probably told you to run. He turned to face her. That's not nothing, Emily. It felt like nothing. It felt like I was playing dress-up in someone else's life. That's because you're still waiting for permission to claim it. Adrian took a drink, his eyes never leaving her face. When are you going to understand that this person you've become over the past 2 weeks isn't a performance? It's not something you borrowed from me. It's you. It's who you were before Nathaniel Ashford convinced you to be smaller. Emily set her glass down before she could drop it. You don't know that. I do. Because I've spent every day for 2 weeks watching you fight against your own instincts. Watching you apologize for taking up space, for asking questions, for existing in my home like you had any right to be here. And every single time, I had to remind you that you didn't need permission, that you were already enough. He moved closer, sitting down on the coffee table directly in front of her, so they were eye level. Do you know what the difference is between you and Nathaniel's new bride? Emily shook her head, not trusting her voice. She knows her worth, not because she's better than you or smarter or more deserving, but because no one ever convinced her she was less. And you can have that too. You can walk through the world like you belong in it, but you have to stop waiting for someone else to tell you it's okay. The words hit harder than Emily expected. She felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been sealed shut since Nathaniel ended their engagement, maybe longer. Tears burned behind her eyes, and she blinked hard, refusing to let them fall. I don't know how, she whispered. Yes, you do. You did it tonight. You just need to keep doing it. Adrian reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture so gentle it felt completely at odds with everything Emily knew about him. His hand lingered against her cheek, his thumb brushing her jawline, and Emily's breath caught. This was dangerous, this moment, this closeness, this feeling building between them that had nothing to do with their arrangement and everything to do with the fact that Emily had spent 2 weeks falling for a man who was supposed to be temporary. Adrian, his phone rang. The spell shattered. Adrian pulled back, his expression shifting from something soft to something hard and focused in the space of a heartbeat. He pulled the phone from his pocket, glanced at the screen, and his jaw tightened. I need to take this, he said, already standing. Don't go anywhere. He walked toward his office, speaking in rapid Italian before he'd even closed the door. Emily sat alone in the living room, her heart still racing, trying to process what had just happened, or what had almost happened. She picked up her drink and finished it in one long swallow, welcoming the burn. Then she stood, kicked off her heels, and made her way toward the guest suite. She needed to get out of this dress, wash off the makeup, take down her hair. She needed to feel like herself again, even if she wasn't entirely sure who that was anymore. The guest suite was exactly as she'd left it, perfectly made bed, pristine bathroom, everything in its designated place. Emily caught sight of herself in the full-length mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. She still looked expensive, still looked like someone who belonged at political weddings and society events. But there was something different in her eyes now, something that looked almost like confidence. She was reaching for the zipper on her dress when she heard it, shouting, loud enough to carry through the supposedly soundproof walls of the penthouse. Emily froze, her hand still on the zipper, listening. The shouting continued, Adrian's voice, angry and commanding, speaking that same rapid Italian she'd heard him use on phone calls. But there was something else beneath it, something that sounded like fear. Before she could talk herself out of it, Emily left the guest suite and moved toward Adrian's office. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap she could see him pacing, phone pressed to his ear, his free hand running through his hair in a gesture that suggested he was barely holding on to his composure. Non mi importa cosa dice, he snapped into the phone. Lo voglio fuori dalla città entro domattina o c'è un problema, capito? Emily didn't speak Italian, but she understood tone. And Adrian's tone said that someone had made a very serious mistake. He ended the call, threw his phone onto the desk hard enough that Emily was surprised it didn't shatter, and stood there with his hands braced against the desk, his shoulders rigid with tension. Emily should have walked away, should have gone back to the guest suite and pretended she hadn't heard anything. But instead she pushed the door open and stepped inside. Adrian's head snapped up. For a split second she saw something raw in his expression, anger maybe, or frustration, or something darker that made her pulse quicken. Then his usual mask slammed back into place. I told you to stay in the living room. I heard shouting. And you thought walking toward it was a good idea? I thought you might need... Emily stopped, suddenly uncertain. I don't know. Something. Adrian laughed, but there was no humor in it. What I need is for people to follow basic instructions. What I need is for problems to stay solved instead of crawling back the moment I turn my back. What I need... He stopped himself, shaking his head. You should go to bed, Emily. It's late. What happened? Nothing you need to worry about. Adrian, I said it's nothing. His voice was sharp now, cutting. This isn't part of our arrangement. You don't get to ask questions about my business. You don't get to stand here looking concerned like we're... He stopped again, his jaw working like he was physically restraining the words. Like we're what? Emily asked quietly. Like this is real. The words landed between them like broken glass. Emily felt something in her chest twist painfully, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. It feels real, she said. Because you want it to be. Because you're still looking for someone to save you, and I made the mistake of making you think I could be that person. Adrian moved around the desk, putting more distance between them. But that's not what this is. You came to me with a problem. I helped you solve it. Now the job's done, and we can both move on with our lives. The job's done, Emily repeated numbly. Yes. You went to the wedding. You proved whatever you needed to prove. Our deal is complete. Just like that. Just like that. Adrian wouldn't look at her, kept his gaze fixed on something past her shoulder, his expression carefully neutral. You can stay here tonight, but tomorrow you should go back to your apartment, back to your life. Emily felt like she'd been slapped. You're throwing me out. I'm fulfilling the terms of our agreement. There's a difference. Is there? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're pushing me away the second things started to feel complicated. Things aren't complicated. They're exactly what they've always been. Temporary. Liar. The word came out before Emily could stop it, sharp and accusatory. You're lying. To me, to yourself, I don't know which. But you felt what I felt tonight. In the car, in the living room. I felt nothing. Adrian's voice was ice. You're reading into things that aren't there because you're lonely and hurt and desperate for someone to tell you you're worth something. But I'm not that person, Emily. I'm not going to be your next mistake. The cruelty of it stole Emily's breath. She stood there, still wearing the dress he'd bought her, still carrying the confidence he'd taught her to wear, and felt every piece of it crumble to dust. "You're right," she said quietly. "You're not Nathaniel. You're worse. At least he had the decency to be honest about why he didn't want me." She turned and walked out before Adrian could respond, made it back to the guest suite, and closed the door behind her with enough control that it didn't slam. Then she collapsed onto the edge of the bed and finally let the tears fall. She cried for Nathaniel and the future she'd lost. She cried for the woman she'd been 2 weeks ago, small and invisible and convinced she deserved it. But mostly she cried for Adrian, for the man who'd seen her when she was invisible and taught her how to be seen, only to push her away the moment she started to matter. Emily didn't sleep that night. She lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the penthouse settling around her. At some point, maybe 2, maybe 3 in the morning, she heard Adrian's footsteps in the hallway outside her door. They stopped, stayed there for a long moment, then continued past toward his own room. She wondered if he couldn't sleep either. When morning came, Emily packed her things with mechanical efficiency. The clothes Adrian had bought her stayed in the closet. The jewelry stayed on the dresser. She took only what she'd arrived with, her phone, her wallet, the grandmother's ring Adrian had refused to accept. She was almost to the door when Claudia appeared, looking immaculate despite the early hour. "Mister, Moretti asked me to arrange a car for you," she said, her tone professionally neutral. "That won't be necessary. I'll take the subway." "He insists." Emily met the older woman's eyes. "Tell Mr. Moretti that our arrangement is over, and I don't need anything else from him." She left before Claudia could respond, took the elevator down to the lobby, and stepped out into a morning that was too bright and too normal for how wrong everything felt. The subway ride back to her apartment took 40 minutes. Emily spent it staring at her reflection in the dark window, watching the city blur past, trying to figure out how she'd gone from desperate and broken to strong and confident to completely shattered in the space of 2 weeks. Her apartment was exactly as she'd left it, small, cluttered, smelling faintly of the takeout she'd eaten 3 weeks ago and never quite cleaned up properly. It felt like stepping back into a life that no longer fit, like trying to wear clothes she'd outgrown. Emily dropped her bag on the floor and sat down on her second-hand couch. Her phone buzzed almost immediately. Maya, who'd probably been waiting for an update since last night. "How was it? Tell me everything." Emily stared at the message, trying to figure out how to summarize the past 2 weeks. How to explain that she'd made a deal with a dangerous man, and it had worked exactly the way she'd hoped, and also destroyed her in ways she didn't see coming. She typed and deleted 3 different responses before settling on something simple. "It's over. I'll call you later." She spent the rest of the day trying to reclaim her old life. She did laundry, she cleaned the kitchen. She even opened her laptop and looked at her work email, which had accumulated 2 weeks' worth of messages she didn't have the energy to read. But no matter what she did, she couldn't stop thinking about Adrian, about the way he'd looked at her in the living room, like she was something precious he wanted to protect, about the way he'd pushed her away in his office, like she was something dangerous he needed to escape, about the way she'd fallen for him despite knowing better. By the time evening came, Emily had made a decision. She couldn't go back to who she'd been before. That woman was gone. Not because of Adrian, but because Emily had finally seen what she was capable of when she stopped apologizing for existing. But she also couldn't keep living in this in-between space, haunted by a man who'd made it clear he didn't want her. She needed to move forward, needed to take everything Adrian had taught her and use it to build something that belonged to her, not to him or Nathaniel or anyone else who'd tried to define her worth. She was drafting her resignation letter, because going back to the law office where she'd been invisible for 3 years felt impossible now, when her phone rang. Unknown number. Emily almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "Emily Carter?" A man's voice, unfamiliar. "Who's asking?" "My name is Marco. I work for Adrian Moretti. He asked me to call you." Emily's heart stopped. "Why?" "There's been a situation. Mr. Moretti wanted you to know that you might be contacted by some people asking questions about last night, about the wedding. If that happens, he wants you to call this number immediately and not answer any of their questions." "What kind of situation?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss details, but Mr. Moretti was very clear that your safety is a priority." My safety. Emily felt something cold settle in her stomach. What does that mean? It means you should be careful, Miss Carter. And if you notice anything unusual, anyone following you, anyone asking about your relationship with Mr. Moretti, you call this number. Understood? Marco, what the hell is going on? But the line was already dead. Emily sat frozen on her couch, the phone still pressed to her ear, trying to process what she'd just heard. Your safety is a priority. Anyone following you, don't answer questions. This wasn't over. Whatever Adrian was involved in, whatever business had made him shout in Italian at 2 a.m, it had somehow extended to include her. She'd walked into his world for one night, and now his world was following her home. Emily's hands were shaking as she set the phone down. She should have been terrified, should have been calling the police or Maya or anyone who could tell her this was going to be fine. But instead, she felt something else entirely. She felt angry. Adrian had pushed her away, had told her their arrangement was over, that she needed to go back to her life. And now he was sending his people to warn her about situations he wouldn't explain, dangers he wouldn't name, consequences of a choice she'd made without understanding what it would cost. If he thought she was going to sit in her apartment and wait for permission to know what was happening, he didn't know her at all. Emily grabbed her jacket and her keys and headed for the door. She didn't have a plan, didn't know what she'd say when she got there, but she knew exactly where she was going. The Crimson Lounge looked different in daylight, less mysterious, more utilitarian, like seeing a stage set with all the lights on. Emily walked up to the entrance where she'd stood 3 weeks ago with a velvet box and a desperate plan and found the same hostess guarding the door. The woman's eyebrows went up in recognition. Miss Carter, I need to see Adrian. Mr. Moretti isn't taking visitors today. I don't care. Tell him I'm here. I'm afraid that's not possible. Tell him, Emily said, her voice harder than she'd ever heard it, that if he doesn't see me right now, I'm going to walk into that ballroom and start asking very loud questions about what kind of business requires warning people about their safety. I'm sure your other guests would find that fascinating. The hostess's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Respect, maybe, or recognition that Emily wasn't bluffing. Wait here. She disappeared inside. Emily waited, her heart pounding, half convinced Adrian would refuse to see her. But 5 minutes later, the same security guard from her first visit appeared and gestured for her to follow. The walk to Adrian's office felt both familiar and foreign. Emily had been here before, but she'd been a different person then. Smaller, more desperate. Now she was just angry. The guard knocked twice and stepped aside. Emily didn't wait for permission. She pushed the door open and walked in. Adrian was standing by the window, exactly where he'd been last night, looking out at the city. He didn't turn when she entered. You shouldn't be here, he said. I got a very interesting phone call from someone named Marco. He said my safety was a priority. Want to explain what that means? It means exactly what it sounds like. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting. Emily crossed the room until she was standing directly behind him, close enough to see his reflection in the glass. He looked tired, more than tired. He looked like he hadn't slept, like he'd spent the night fighting battles she couldn't see. What happened at the wedding? She asked. Nothing that concerns you. Marco seems to think it does. Marco is being cautious. Adrian, stop. Emily moved around him, forcing him to look at her. Stop treating me like I'm some fragile thing that needs to be protected from the truth. You spent 2 weeks teaching me how to be strong, how to face things that scared me, how to stop running. So don't stand here and tell me I should go home and pretend none of this is happening. Adrian's jaw tightened. You don't understand what you're asking. Then help me understand. I can't. Why not? Because the less you know, the safer you are. Emily laughed, sharp and bitter. That's rich coming from the man who dragged me into his world in the first place. You made me part of this, Adrian. The moment you agreed to go to that wedding, the moment you taught me how to walk and talk and exist like someone who mattered, you made me part of whatever this is. So don't act like you're protecting me by shutting me out. You're just protecting yourself. You're right. Adrian's voice was flat, emotionless. I am protecting myself. Because letting you get any closer is the stupidest thing I could possibly do. Why? Because everyone I let close ends up dead or gone or wishing they'd never met me. Because this life, the one you think you want to be part of, destroys people. And you've already been destroyed enough. The raw honesty of it stopped Emily cold. She looked at Adrian, really looked at him, and saw past the expensive clothes and the controlled violence and the carefully constructed walls. Saw the man underneath who'd agreed to help a stranger because he understood what it meant to feel invisible. Who'd spent 2 weeks teaching her how to survive because maybe, somewhere deep down, he was still trying to figure out how to survive himself. "What happened at the wedding?" she asked again, softer this time. Adrian turned away from her, his hands bracing against the window frame. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, finally, he said, "Someone tried to kill me." The words hit Emily like a physical blow. "What?" "Not during the ceremony, after. While we were leaving, a car followed us from the estate. 3 men. They would have succeeded if my driver hadn't noticed and taken an alternate route." He looked at her reflection in the glass. "That phone call I took when we got back, that was my head of security telling me they'd found the men who'd been sent. Telling me someone had put a price on my head high enough that people were getting reckless. But you're okay." "I'm fine. You're fine. Everyone's fine." His voice was bitter. "Except now whoever ordered the hit knows I was at that wedding, knows I was with you, which means they might decide your leverage." Emily felt her legs go weak. Leverage? A way to get to me. A weakness they can exploit. Adrian finally turned to face her fully. "That's why Marco called. That's why I told you to leave this morning. Because the moment you stepped into my world, you became a target, and I can't—" His voice cracked slightly. "I can't protect you if you keep putting yourself in danger by being near me. So what? I'm just supposed to go home and hope they forget about me?" "Yes." "And if they don't? Then I'll handle it." Emily shook her head. "You really think I'm going to sit in my apartment and wait for you to handle whatever this is? You really think after everything you taught me, I'm just going to go back to being invisible?" "That's exactly what I think. Because the alternative is watching you get hurt because of me, and I won't do that. You don't get to make that choice for me. I do when it's my mess that put you in danger." Emily stepped closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in Adrian's eyes, the tension in his shoulders, the way he was holding himself together through sheer force of will. "Tell me something," she said quietly. "When you pushed me away last night, was it really because our arrangement was over, or was it because you were already trying to protect me from this?" Adrian didn't answer, didn't need to. The answer was written all over his face. "I'm not going anywhere," Emily said. "I'm not going back to my apartment to hide. I'm not going to pretend the past 2 weeks didn't happen. You made me part of your world, Adrian, and now you're stuck with me." "Emily, no. You don't get to push me away for my own good. You don't get to decide I'm too fragile to handle the truth. I'm standing here, in your office, knowing someone tried to kill you last night, and I'm not running. So either tell me what's really going on, or I walk out that door and start asking questions until I find someone who will." Adrian stared at her for a long moment. Then impossibly he smiled, that same sharp, cold smile from their first meeting that somehow felt warmer now. "You're insane," he said. "I learned from the best." He shook his head, but Emily could see the moment his resolve started to crack. Could see him weighing the risks, calculating the angles, trying to figure out if letting her in was worth the cost. Finally, he said, "If I tell you this, if I bring you all the way into this, there's no going back. You understand that?" "I understand. You'll know things that will make you complicit, that will make you as much a part of this world as I am." "Good." Adrian crossed the distance between them in 2 steps. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone in an echo of the gesture from last night. "Last chance to walk away," he said quietly. Emily held his gaze. "I'm not walking anywhere." "Then stay close to me, because things are about to get very dangerous, and I need to know you can handle it." "I can handle it. We'll see." He dropped his hand and moved toward his desk, pulling out his phone and making a call. When someone answered, he spoke in rapid Italian again. Instructions, Emily assumed, based on the tone. He ended the call and looked at her. "Marco's going to bring your things from your apartment. You're staying here until this is resolved." "Adrian, that's not negotiable. If you want to be part of this, you follow my rules. And rule number 1 is that you don't leave my sight until I know you're safe." Emily wanted to argue, wanted to tell him she didn't need his protection, that she could take care of herself. But the truth was, she had no idea what she was walking into. No idea who tried to kill Adrian or why, or what they'd do if they found out about her. So instead, she nodded. Okay. Okay. Adrian studied her for another moment, then said, "You asked what happened at the wedding. The truth is, I've been at war with another organization for the better part of a year. Territory disputes, disagreements about how business should be conducted, the usual. But recently things have escalated. They've started targeting my people, and I've retaliated in kind. Last night was them sending a message that nowhere is safe, not even a senator's son's wedding. And now they know about me. Now they know I brought someone with me. Whether they know who you are or what you mean to me is still unclear. But I'm not taking chances." "What you mean to me?" The words hung in the air between them, unacknowledged but impossible to ignore. "What happens now?" Emily asked. "Now? Now we finish this. I find out who gave the order, I make sure they understand what happens when they come after what's mine, and I end this war before anyone else gets hurt." "How?" Adrian's smile turned predatory. "By doing what I do best, making people regret underestimating me." He moved past her toward the door, then stopped and looked back. "Are you sure about this, Emily? Because once we walk out this door together, there's no more pretending, no more performances. This becomes real." Emily thought about her apartment, small and safe and suffocating. Thought about the law office where she'd spent 3 years being invisible. Thought about the life she'd built that had never quite felt like it belonged to her. Then she thought about the past 2 weeks, about learning how to take up space, about standing in front of Nathaniel and feeling nothing, about falling for a dangerous man who saw her when she was invisible. "I'm sure," she said. Adrian extended his hand. Emily took it, and together they walked out into the war. The war room, as Adrian called it, was located in the basement of the Crimson Lounge, a space Emily hadn't known existed until he led her down a service elevator that required a key card and a fingerprint scan to access. The room itself was all concrete and steel, lined with monitors showing security footage from what looked like a dozen different locations across the city. 3 men were already there when they arrived, all of them going silent the moment Adrian walked in with Emily at his side. Marco was easy to identify, the one who stepped forward immediately, his eyes flicking to Emily with barely concealed concern before focusing on Adrian. "Boss," he said, "we have a problem." "When don't we have a problem?" Adrian moved to the largest monitor, studying whatever was displayed there. "What am I looking at?" "Security footage from the Belmont estate. This is from last night, approximately 20 minutes after you left." Marco pressed a button, and the image zoomed in on a section of the parking area. 3 men stood near a black sedan talking. One of them pulled out a phone, made a call, and then all 3 got into the car and drove away. "These are the same men who followed you. We tracked their vehicle to a warehouse on the east side. By the time we got there, they were gone." "But you found something." "We found evidence they'd been there, and we found this." Marco handed Adrian a folder. "Surveillance photos. Looks like they've been watching you for at least 2 weeks." Adrian opened the folder, his expression unchanging as he flipped through what looked like dozens of photographs. Emily couldn't see them clearly from where she stood, but she caught glimpses. Adrian leaving the Crimson Lounge, Adrian getting into his car, Adrian walking into his building, Adrian with Emily. There were at least 4 photos of them together, leaving for the wedding, walking through the Belmont estate, dancing. And one taken through the window of Adrian's penthouse, showing them standing in the living room the night they'd returned. Emily felt her stomach drop. "They were watching us." "They were watching me," Adrian corrected, his voice tight. "You were collateral." "Same difference." Emily moved closer, looking at the photos over his shoulder. In every single one, she looked completely oblivious, smiling, talking, existing in Adrian's world without any awareness that someone was documenting every moment. "How long have they been doing this?" "Long enough to know your routine, where you live, where you work, who you talk to." Marco's tone was apologetic but firm. "I'm sorry, Miss Carter. We didn't know they'd expanded their surveillance until we found these." "Who are they?" Emily asked. "Who's behind this?" The 3 men exchanged glances. Adrian set the folder down and turned to face her. "His name is Vincent Calabrese. He runs the East Side Territory. Gambling, protection, Some import business that's probably not as legitimate as he claims. We've had an understanding for years. He stays on his side, I stay on mine. Everyone makes money. Adrian's jaw tightened. 6 months ago, that understanding fell apart. One of his men crossed into my territory, started leaning on businesses that were under my protection. I made it clear that it wasn't acceptable. He made it clear he didn't care. Things escalated. How escalated? People got hurt, property got damaged, lines got crossed that shouldn't have been crossed. Adrian met her eyes. I'm not going to lie to you and pretend I'm innocent in this, Emily. I've done things to Calabrese's operation that would make you walk out of this room right now. But he's done worse. And now he's decided that the best way to win is to make this personal. By going after you at a wedding. By going after me in a place where I should have been safe, where there were civilians, politicians, people who have nothing to do with this life. Adrian's voice went cold. That's not how this works. There are rules, lines you don't cross. And he crossed every single one of them. Emily absorbed this, trying to reconcile the man who'd spent 2 weeks teaching her how to be confident with the one standing in front of her now, talking about territory and protection and rules that involved hurting people. What are you going to do? She asked. End it. Adrian turned back to Marco. Do we have a location on Calabrese? He's been moving around, using different safe houses, never staying in one place more than a night. But we think we know where he'll be tomorrow evening. Marco pulled up another image on the monitor. A warehouse, industrial area, isolated. He's got a shipment coming in, high-value merchandise he'll want to personally oversee. Our source says he'll be there from 8 to midnight. Your source is reliable? As reliable as they come. He's one of Calabrese's lieutenants who's decided he doesn't like the direction things are going. Adrian studied the image for a long moment. How many men will he have with him? Best guess, 10, maybe 12, plus whatever security is already on site for the shipment. So we're outnumbered. We're always outnumbered, boss. Hasn't stopped us before. Adrian's mouth curved into something that might have been a smile if it weren't so predatory. Get everyone ready. I want full tactical gear, non-lethal options where possible, and eyes on every exit. If Calabrese tries to run, I want to know about it before he makes it to his car. What about Miss Carter? Emily spoke before Adrian could. I'm coming with you. All 4 men turned to stare at her. Adrian's expression shifted from tactical planning to something closer to disbelief. Absolutely not. You said I was part of this now. That means I don't sit in your penthouse while you go start a war. That's exactly what it means. No, it means I get to make my own choices about what risks I'm willing to take. Emily crossed her arms, holding Adrian's gaze. You're going after the man who tried to kill you, the man who's been watching us for 2 weeks. I have a right to be there when you end this. You have a right to stay alive, which you won't be if you walk into a firefight with trained men who have absolutely no problem killing anyone in their way. Then teach me how to not get killed. Adrian stared at her for a beat too long, then turned to Marco. Give us the room. Marco and the other 2 men filed out without argument, closing the door behind them. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush. Emily? Adrian's voice was carefully controlled. I understand you want to be part of this. I understand you feel like you're owed some kind of closure or revenge or whatever you think you'll get by being there tomorrow night. But this isn't like the wedding. This isn't a performance where the worst thing that can happen is someone says something cruel. People are going to get hurt, possibly killed. And I need to be focused on ending this, not on making sure you don't get caught in the crossfire. I know that. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're treating this like some kind of adventure instead of recognizing how dangerous it actually is. The accusation stung. Emily felt her defenses rise, felt the old instinct to back down and apologize and make herself smaller kick in. But she'd spent 2 weeks learning how to fight that instinct. She wasn't going to stop now. I'm not treating this like an adventure, she said quietly. I'm treating it like the consequence of a choice I made. I chose to ask for your help. I chose to go to that wedding with you. I chose to come here today instead of going home. And now I'm choosing to see this through, not because I think it's going to be fun or exciting, but because running away and hiding while you handle my mess isn't who I am anymore. This isn't your mess. It became my mess the moment those photos were taken, the moment Calabrese decided I was leverage. Emily moved closer, close enough to see the exhaustion etched into Adrian's features. You can't protect me by keeping me locked away, Adrian. You can only protect me by teaching me how to protect myself, so that's what I'm asking. Teach me. Adrian closed his eyes, and for a moment he looked older than his 35 years, tired in a way that went beyond one sleepless night. When he opened them again, there was resignation there, alongside something that looked almost like pride. You're not going to change your mind about this, are you? No. Even if I tell you it's the single stupidest decision you could possibly make? Even then. He shook his head, but Emily caught the ghost of a smile. Fine, but you follow my instructions exactly. No improvising, no heroics, no deciding you know better than the people who've been doing this for years. Understood? Understood. And if I tell you to run, you run. You don't look back, you don't argue, you just get as far away as possible. Deal? Emily hesitated. Everything in her wanted to argue, wanted to tell him she wouldn't leave him behind. But she could see in his eyes that this was the condition. The only way he'd agree to let her be part of this. Deal, she said. Adrian pulled out his phone and made a call. Marco, get back in here and bring someone who can teach basic defensive combat in the next 6 hours. The next 6 hours were the most physically demanding of Emily's life. The woman Marco brought in was named Sophia, compact, muscular, with the kind of quiet intensity that suggested she could kill you with her bare hands and not break a sweat. She didn't ask questions about why Emily needed to learn self-defense in a single evening, just got to work. They started with basics: how to stand, how to move, how to use someone's momentum against them. Sophia was a brutal teacher, pulling no punches when Emily made mistakes, offering no comfort when Emily hit the mat for the 10th time in as many minutes. Again, Sophia said, barely winded while Emily gasped for air. Someone grabs your arm from behind. What do? Emily tried to remember the sequence. Drop her weight, twist toward the grab, use her elbow. She executed it sloppily, too slow, telegraphing the movement before she'd even started. Sophia blocked it easily. Too obvious. They'll see it coming and adjust. You need to make them think you're compliant right up until you're not. Try again. They practiced for 3 hours straight. By the time Sophia finally called a break, Emily's entire body ached and she was pretty sure she had bruises forming on top of bruises. But she could execute basic escapes without thinking, could recognize weak points in someone's grip, could move in ways that might buy her precious seconds if things went wrong. It wasn't enough. Emily knew it wasn't enough, but it was better than nothing. Adrian appeared while Emily was catching her breath, watching from the doorway with an expression she couldn't quite read. How's she doing? He asked Sophia. She's a fast learner, won't win any fights, but she might survive one long enough to get away. Sophia handed Emily a bottle of water. Keep practicing those escapes. Muscle memory will save your life when your brain shuts down. She left them alone. Emily drank half the bottle in one go, then looked at Adrian. Tell me the truth. Am I going to be a liability tomorrow? Honestly, probably. He moved into the room, closing the distance between them. But I'd rather have you where I can see you than sitting somewhere wondering if you're safe. At least this way, if something goes wrong, I'll know. That's not very reassuring. It's not meant to be. Adrian reached out and tucked a strand of sweat-dampened hair behind her ear, a gesture that was becoming familiar, intimate in a way that made Emily's pulse quicken despite her exhaustion. Emily, you can still change your mind. You can stay here tomorrow while we handle Calabrese, and no one will think less of you. I'll think less of me. Why? Because you're smart enough to stay out of a situation that could get you killed? Because I'm tired of being the person who watches from the sidelines while other people take risks. Emily set the water bottle down and met his eyes. I've spent my entire life being careful, being safe, making choices that wouldn't upset anyone or cause problems or make me stand out. And where did it get me? Engaged to a man who thought I was forgettable, working a job where I was invisible, living in an apartment that felt more like a waiting room than a home. And you think walking into danger is going to fix that? I think choosing danger for myself is better than having safety chosen for me by people who don't actually care about what I want. Emily moved closer, close enough to feel the heat radiating off Adrian's body. You taught me that. You taught me that I could be someone who takes up space, who makes demands, who doesn't apologize for existing. So don't ask me to go back to being small just because it's safer. Adrian's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone in that maddeningly gentle gesture that contrasted so sharply with everything else about him. You're going to get yourself killed, he said softly. Not if you teach me how to survive. I'm trying to. You're just not listening. Then make me listen. The air between them went electric. Emily could see the war happening behind Adrian's eyes. The part of him that wanted to keep her safe fighting against the part that understood why she couldn't accept that safety. The part that wanted to push her away, battling the part that wanted to pull her closer. The latter won. Adrian closed the distance and kissed her. It wasn't gentle, wasn't tentative or careful, or any of the things a first kiss probably should have been. It was desperate and claiming, and tasted like the violence he carried with him everywhere. Emily kissed him back with equal intensity, her hands fisting in his shirt, her entire body responding to the contact like she'd been waiting for this since the moment they'd met. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Adrian rested his forehead against hers. "This is a mistake," he said. "Probably. You should walk away now before this gets more complicated." "Too late." He laughed. A real laugh this time. Not the cold, sharp thing he usually offered. "Yeah, too late." They stayed like that for a moment, caught in the space between what they were and what they were becoming. Then Adrian's phone buzzed, shattering the moment. He pulled back, checking the message, his expression shifting back to business. "Marco has the final details for tomorrow. We should go over them." "Okay." Emily's lips still tingled from the kiss. Her heart was still racing, but she forced herself to focus. What do I need to know? What she needed to know, apparently, was everything. They spent the next 2 hours in the war room while Marco laid out the plan with military precision. The warehouse was on the east side, isolated enough that civilian casualties were unlikely, but accessible enough that escape routes existed. Calabrese's shipment was scheduled to arrive at 8. Marco's source confirmed he'd be there personally to oversee the transfer. Adrian's plan was straightforward: surround the warehouse, cut off escape routes, and force a confrontation on their terms. Ideally, Calabrese would see he was outnumbered and surrender without violence. Realistically, there would be a fight. Emily's role was simple: stay in the vehicle with Marco, stay out of sight, and under no circumstances leave the car unless explicitly told to do so. It was the compromise Adrian had insisted on. She could be there, but she couldn't be in the line of fire. Emily agreed because she didn't have a choice, but she also knew that plans rarely survived contact with reality. The rest of the evening passed in preparation. Adrian's people arrived in waves, men and women Emily had never seen before, all of them moving with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested they'd done this many times. They checked weapons, went over tactical positions, discussed contingencies for scenarios Emily didn't want to think about too closely. Through it all, Adrian remained calm, focused. Every inch the man who'd built an empire on making people believe things. Except now, what he was making them believe was that this would work, that they could walk into Calabrese's territory and walk out alive. Emily wanted to believe it too. By the time night fell, she was back in Adrian's penthouse with explicit instructions to rest. She tried. Lay down in the guest suite that had become familiar, closed her eyes, and attempted to quiet her mind enough to sleep. It didn't work. She gave up around midnight and found Adrian in his office, surrounded by files and looking about as well-rested as she felt. "Can't sleep?" he asked without looking up. "Can't stop thinking about tomorrow. Join the club." He set down whatever he'd been reading and gestured for her to sit. "What's on your mind?" Everything, nothing. The kiss they'd shared that neither of them had mentioned since. The fact that in less than 12 hours she'd be sitting in a car while the man she'd fallen for walked into danger. The possibility that this could all go wrong in ways she couldn't predict or control. "What if Calabrese doesn't surrender?" Emily asked. "Then we make him. And if you can't?" Adrian's expression went cold. "Then he doesn't leave that warehouse alive." The bluntness of it should have shocked her, should have made her recoil, should have reminded her that this man sitting across from her was capable of violence she couldn't comprehend. But instead, Emily just felt tired. "Have you ever killed anyone?" she asked quietly. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. "Yes." "How many?" "Does it matter?" "It might. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. I've killed 4 people in my life. 3 of them were actively trying to kill me or someone I was protecting. The 4th was a man who hurt a child under my protection and thought money would make it go away. His voice was matter of fact, clinical. I don't enjoy it. I don't take pride in it, but I don't lose sleep over it either. They made choices that led them to that moment, and I made the choice to end it. That's the world I live in. And tomorrow? If it comes to that with Calabrese? Tomorrow, if it comes to that, I'll do what needs to be done to protect my people, to protect you. And then I'll move forward, the same way I always have. Emily absorbed this, trying to reconcile the man who'd kissed her 6 hours ago with the one calmly discussing the possibility of taking a life. They should have been different people, but somehow they weren't. Adrian contained multitudes, protector and predator, teacher and killer, the man who'd seen her when she was invisible, and the one who could end someone without hesitation. And she was falling in love with all of it. I don't know how to be the person who's okay with this, Emily admitted. You don't have to be okay with it. You just have to decide if you can live with it. Adrian stood, moved around the desk, and crouched in front of her chair so they were eye level. I told you this world destroys people, Emily. I meant it. If you stay, if you choose this, choose me. You're choosing everything that comes with it. The violence, the danger, the moral compromises that will keep you up at night. And I can't promise it'll get easier. I can only promise I'll be honest with you about what it costs. What does it cost you? The question seemed to catch him off guard. He looked away, jaw working, before finally answering. Everything I might have been, if I'd made different choices. Everyone I might have loved if I'd lived a different life. He met her eyes again. But I stopped mourning that person a long time ago. This is who I am. This is the only version of myself I know how to be. Emily reached out and took his hand, threading her fingers through his. Then teach me how to be the version of myself that can exist in your world without losing who I am in mine. I don't know if that's possible. We won't know unless we try. Adrian pulled her forward into a kiss that was softer than their first, more tentative, like he was memorizing the feel of her mouth against his. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers in an echo of earlier. Get some sleep, he murmured. Tomorrow's going to be long. Will you stay with me? She felt him tense, felt him start to pull away, to rebuild the walls he'd let down for just a moment. But then something shifted. He relaxed, his hand tightening on hers. Yeah, he said quietly. I'll stay. They ended up in Emily's guest suite, fully clothed on top of the covers, Adrian's arm around her shoulders while she rested her head on his chest. It was the most domestic thing they'd done, and also somehow the most intimate. No performance, no audience, just 2 people who'd found each other in the worst possible circumstances, trying to find comfort before walking into worse. Emily must have dozed eventually because she woke to pale morning light filtering through the windows and Adrian already gone. A note on the nightstand in handwriting she recognized from the documents she'd seen in his office. 7 p.m. Don't be late. She stared at the note for a long moment, then got up and started preparing for the day ahead. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Emily tried to eat but couldn't stomach more than toast. Tried to distract herself with her phone but couldn't focus on anything long enough to matter. By the time evening arrived, her nerves were so frayed she was practically vibrating. Marco picked her up at 6:30 in an unmarked SUV with tinted windows. He didn't make small talk, just drove through the city toward the east side while Emily watched the neighborhoods change from familiar to foreign. By the time they reached the warehouse district, the sun was setting, painting everything in shades of orange and red that felt ominous. The warehouse came into view, exactly as it had looked in the surveillance photos. Large, industrial, surrounded by empty lots and chain-link fencing. No lights visible from outside, but Emily could see vehicles parked near the loading dock. Calabrese was already there. Marco pulled the SUV into position behind a cluster of abandoned buildings about 200 yards away. From here, they had a clear line of sight to the warehouse entrance, but were hidden from view. 2 other vehicles were already in position at different vantage points, Adrian's people ready to move on his signal. "Where's Adrian?" Emily asked. "South entrance with Sophia and 3 others. Once Calabrese's shipment arrives and he's inside, They'll move to block the exits. Marco handed her a small radio with an earpiece. You'll be able to hear everything, but don't transmit unless it's an emergency. And remember the deal. You stay in this vehicle no matter what happens. Emily took the radio with shaking hands and fitted the earpiece. Immediately, she could hear voices. Adrian giving quiet instructions, someone confirming positions. The controlled chaos of people preparing for violence. Then Adrian's voice, clear and calm. Sound off. One by one, his people responded. Emily counted 8 voices total, not including Marco. 9 people against Calabrese's 10 or 12, plus whatever security was already on site. They were still outnumbered. A truck appeared in the distance, headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. It drove straight to the warehouse, backed up to the loading dock with practiced efficiency. Men emerged from inside the warehouse. Emily counted 6 and started unloading whatever cargo the truck carried. Target confirmed, someone said over the radio. Calabrese just exited the building. East side, 3 men with him. Emily's heart hammered. This was it. This was actually happening. Adrian's voice came through the earpiece, still calm, still controlled. Wait for my signal. Nobody moves until I say. The unloading continued. Calabrese stood watching, gesturing occasionally, looking completely at ease, like this was just another business transaction. Nothing unusual, nothing to worry about. Then everything went wrong. One of Calabrese's men pulled out his phone, looked at it, and immediately started shouting. Calabrese's head snapped around, scanning the perimeter. He'd been warned. Someone had tipped him off. Abort! Adrian's voice sharp now. Everyone pull back! Gunfire erupted. Emily couldn't tell who shot first. All she knew was that suddenly the night exploded with muzzle flashes and the crack of weapons and people scattering in every direction. She watched through the windshield as Adrian's people moved from their positions, returning fire, trying to establish control of a situation that had already spiraled into chaos. Adrian was visible near the south entrance, moving with deadly precision, firing at targets Emily couldn't see. Sophia was beside him, covering his flank. And then Calabrese's men were everywhere, pouring out of the warehouse like they'd been waiting for this. Marco was already moving, putting the SUV in drive. We need to go, now! What about Adrian? He can handle himself. Our job is to get you out of here. No. Emily grabbed the door handle. I'm not leaving him. Miss Carter, you promised. I know what I promised. Emily shoved the door open and was out of the SUV before Marco could stop her. She heard him curse, heard him shouting for her to get back, but she was already running toward the warehouse, toward the gunfire, toward Adrian. This was stupid. This was suicidal. This was everything Adrian had told her not to do. But she couldn't drive away, couldn't sit in safety while he fought, couldn't be the person who chose self-preservation over standing beside someone who mattered. She made it maybe 30 yards before someone grabbed her from behind. Emily's training kicked in before her brain fully processed what was happening. She dropped her weight like Sophia had taught her, twisted toward the grip, drove her elbow back hard. She felt it connect with something solid, heard a grunt of pain, and suddenly the hands were gone. She spun around and found herself face to face with one of Calabrese's men. Younger than she expected, maybe mid-20s, with a gun that was now pointed directly at her chest. Don't move, he said, breathing hard from where she'd caught him with her elbow. Emily froze. All of Sophia's training evaporated in the face of an actual weapon. Her hands went up automatically, her mind screaming at her that this was it. This was how she died, 30 seconds into the stupidest decision she'd ever made. Then Adrian's voice cut through the chaos. Let her go. He'd appeared from nowhere, moving with that same lethal speed Emily had seen at the wedding. His gun was trained on the man holding Emily, his entire body coiled and ready. But there was something different in his expression now, something beyond the cold calculation she'd seen before. He looked terrified. Back off, Moretti, the young man said, his voice shaking slightly. I'll shoot her, I swear I will. You won't. Adrian's voice was unnaturally calm. Because the moment you do, you're dead. And unlike her, you don't have anyone who'll mourn you. You don't know that. I know you're Danny Russo. I know you've been working for Calabrese for 8 months. I know your mother lives in Queens, and your sister just started college at NYU. Adrian took a step closer. I know that if you pull that trigger, none of them will be safe. Ever. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Danny's gun wavered. Emily could see the fear in his eyes, the realization that he'd grabbed the wrong person. That this wasn't just some random woman, this was Adrian Moretti's leverage in reverse. "Let her walk to me," Adrian said quietly. "Do that, and you walk away from this. You get in your car, you drive to your mother's house, and you tell her you're done with Calabrese. You find a different life. One where you don't end up bleeding out in a warehouse because you made a bad choice. Calabrese will kill me if I let her go. Calabrese is going to be too busy worrying about staying alive to care about you. But I will care. I will remember that you had a chance to do the smart thing, and you took it. That matters to me." The standoff lasted maybe 10 seconds. To Emily, it felt like hours. She could hear the continued gunfire around them, could see Adrian's finger resting on the trigger, could feel her own heartbeat like a drum in her ears. Then Danny lowered his gun. "Go," he said to Emily. She didn't need to be told twice. She crossed the distance to Adrian in 3 shaking steps, and he immediately pulled her behind him, keeping his weapon trained on Danny until the younger man backed away and disappeared into the chaos. "What the hell were you thinking?" Adrian's voice was lethal quiet. "I couldn't leave you. You promised me you'd stay in the car." "I know." "You could have been killed." "I know." Adrian grabbed her arm, not gently, and started pulling her back toward where Marco was already moving the SUV closer. "We're leaving, now." "But Calabrese is Marco's problem now. You made your choice, Emily. Now you live with the consequences." They'd almost made it to the SUV when Sophia's voice crackled through the radio. "Adrian, we have a problem. Calabrese is heading for the north exit. If he makes it to his car, I'm occupied." Adrian cut her off. "Let him go." "Boss, if he gets away..." I said let him go." Adrian shoved Emily toward the SUV where Marco was waiting. "Get her out of here. Take her back to the penthouse and don't let her leave until I get there." "What about you?" Emily asked. "I'm finishing this." "Adrian, wait." But he was already moving back toward the warehouse, back toward the danger she'd made so much worse by not following his instructions. Emily tried to go after him, but Marco caught her arm. "Don't," he said firmly. "You've done enough damage for one night." The words stung because they were true. Emily let Marco pull her into the SUV, watched through the window as Adrian disappeared back into the firefight, and felt something break inside her chest. The drive back to the penthouse was silent, except for the continued chatter over the radio. Emily listened to Adrian coordinating his people, listened to them confirming targets and positions and exits, listened to Sophia report that Calabrese had made it to his vehicle and was gone. They'd failed, and it was Emily's fault. By the time they reached Adrian's building, the gunfire had stopped. The radio had gone quiet. Marco pulled into the underground garage and killed the engine, but neither of them moved. "Is he okay?" Emily asked quietly. "He will be. He always is." Marco's tone was neutral, professional. "But you need to understand something, Miss Carter. When you ran toward that warehouse, you didn't just put yourself in danger. You put Adrian in a position where he had to choose between completing the mission and protecting you. That's not fair to him, and it's not fair to the people who depend on him to make the right call." "I know." "Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're still treating this like some kind of adventure, like the consequences aren't real." Marco turned to look at her directly. "Danny Russo could have killed you tonight. Adrian would have killed Danny in response. And then Danny's mother and sister would have suffered because some paralegal from downtown decided she needed to prove something to herself." Emily felt tears burn behind her eyes. "I didn't mean..." "Intention doesn't matter. Results matter. You want to be part of this world? Then you need to understand that your choices affect more than just you. They ripple out. They touch people you'll never meet, and sometimes they destroy lives." Marco's expression softened slightly. "Adrian cares about you. More than he should, probably. But that doesn't mean you get to put him in impossible positions because you're too stubborn to follow instructions." He got out of the SUV without waiting for a response. Emily sat alone in the vehicle for a long moment, Marco's words echoing in her head, before finally dragging herself out and following him to the elevator. The penthouse felt empty without Adrian. Emily went straight to her guest suite, peeled off her clothes, and stood under scalding water until her skin turned red. But no amount of heat could wash away the image of Danny's gun pointed at her chest, of Adrian's face when he'd appeared, of the choice she'd forced him to make. She was wrapped in a towel, sitting on the edge of the bed, when she heard the front door open. Emily pulled on clothes, jeans and a t-shirt, nothing fancy, and made her way to the living room. Adrian was there, looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past 3 hours. His shirt was torn, there was blood on his sleeve that might or might not have been his, and his hands were shaking slightly as he poured himself a drink. "Are you hurt?" Emily asked from the doorway. "No. The blood isn't mine." He downed the drink in one swallow and poured another. "Everyone made it out. 3 injuries, none life-threatening. Calabrese escaped, but we destroyed his shipment and took out half his operation. He'll spend the next 6 months rebuilding instead of coming after me." "I'm sorry." "Are you?" Adrian turned to face her, and Emily saw something dangerous in his expression. "Are you sorry you didn't follow instructions? Or are you sorry you got caught?" "Both, neither. I don't know." Emily moved into the room, keeping distance between them. "I'm sorry I made things harder. I'm sorry I forced you to choose between the mission and me. I'm sorry I didn't listen when you told me to stay in the car. But you do it again." It wasn't a question. Emily wanted to lie, wanted to tell him she'd learned her lesson and would never be that reckless again. But Adrian had asked for honesty from the beginning. She owed him that much. "Probably," she admitted. "If I thought you were in danger and I could help, yeah, I'd probably do it again." Adrian laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You have no idea how to help, Emily. You have 6 hours of defensive training and a death wish. That's not enough to survive in a firefight. That's not enough to do anything except get yourself killed and force me to live with the fact that I failed to protect you. I don't need you to protect me." "Yes, you do. That's the whole point of this. That's why you're here instead of in your apartment. Because someone tried to kill me and you became collateral damage. And the only way to keep you safe is to keep you close." He set his glass down hard enough that Emily was surprised it didn't shatter. "But I can't keep you safe if you won't follow basic instructions. I can't protect you if you keep running toward danger because you're trying to prove something." "I'm not trying to prove anything." "Then what were you doing tonight? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you were trying to prove you're brave enough to exist in my world. That you're strong enough to handle whatever comes. That you're not the quiet, forgettable woman Nathaniel Ashford discarded." Adrian moved closer, his expression intense. "But you don't need to prove any of that to me, Emily. I already know who you are. I've known since the moment you walked into the Crimson Lounge with that ridiculous ring and asked me to help you with something that should have been beneath my notice. You're brave and stubborn and so determined to matter that you'll put yourself in danger just to prove you can. And that terrifies me more than anything Calabrese could ever do." Emily felt tears spill over. "I don't know how to be any other way. I'm not asking you to be different. I'm asking you to trust that you don't have to earn your place here by risking your life. You already belong. You belonged the moment you sat down in my office without being invited and told me you understood what it meant to be underestimated. Then why does it feel like I have to keep proving it? Because Nathaniel convinced you that you weren't enough, that being quiet and comfortable was the same as being forgettable. And now you're so desperate to be the opposite of that. You've swung too far in the other direction." Adrian was right in front of her now, close enough to touch. "You don't need to be reckless to be remarkable, Emily. You just need to be yourself." "And what if myself isn't enough for this world? Then we figure it out together." Adrian pulled her into his arms, holding her tight enough that she could feel his heartbeat. "But you don't get to sacrifice yourself trying to fit into a version of this life that doesn't exist. You don't get to throw yourself into danger because you think that's what I need. What I need is you alive. Everything else is negotiable." Emily pressed her face against his chest and let herself cry. For the fear she'd felt tonight, for the realization of how badly things could have gone, for the understanding that loving Adrian meant accepting that she'd always be walking this edge between who she was and who his world demanded she become. "I hate that I made things worse," she said against his shirt. "You did make things worse. But you also saved yourself when Danny grabbed you. That elbow strike would have made Sophia proud." She felt Adrian's lips against her hair. "And you trusted me to get you out of it. That matters too. Even though I shouldn't have been there in the first place? Even though..." They stood like that for a long time, wrapped around each other in the middle of Adrian's too perfect living room. Eventually, Adrian pulled back just enough to look at her face. "This is the deal," he said. You can be part of this world. You can be at my side when things get dangerous, but you have to trust me when I tell you to stay back. You have to believe that keeping you safe isn't the same as keeping you small. Can you do that? Emily thought about it, really thought about it, about what it meant to exist in Adrian's world without becoming someone she didn't recognize, about finding the balance between being strong and being smart. I can try, she said finally. That's all I'm asking. Adrian kissed her then, slow and deep, like he was trying to memorize the taste of her. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers in that gesture that had become theirs. What happens now? Emily asked. With Calabrese? Now he knows I'm willing to go to war over this, that I'll destroy his operation piece by piece until he either surrenders or runs. Most likely, he'll reach out in the next few days to negotiate terms. Adrian's voice was matter-of-fact. He'll want assurances that I won't come after him again. I'll want assurances that you're off limits. We'll come to an agreement and things will go back to how they were before he decided to cross lines that shouldn't be crossed. Just like that? Just like that. This is how it works. We fight until someone wins or until both sides realize continued fighting costs more than it's worth. Then we make peace until the next time someone decides to test boundaries. Emily tried to imagine living like this. Cycles of violence and negotiation, trusting that temporary peace would hold, knowing it could shatter at any moment. It should have terrified her, should have sent her running back to her quiet apartment and her quiet life. But instead, she just felt tired. I don't know if I can do this, she admitted. I know. And if you decide you can't, I'll understand. I'll make sure you're protected. Make sure Calabrese knows you're not leverage. Make sure you can go back to your life without looking over your shoulder. Adrian's voice was gentle. But I hope you'll stay. Why? Because you make me remember what it's like to want something beyond survival. Because you look at me like I'm more than the violence I carry. Because in 2 weeks you became someone I can't imagine not having in my life. He pulled back to look at her directly. I love you, Emily. And I know that's unfair to say when you're trying to decide if you can handle this world. But you asked for honesty, and that's the truth. Emily's breath caught. She'd known. Some part of her had known for days, maybe weeks. But hearing him say it out loud made it real in a way that changed everything. I love you too, she said. Which is why this is so hard. Because loving you means accepting all of this. The danger, the moral compromises, the fact that people like Danny Russo exist because of choices you've made. And I don't know if I'm strong enough to carry that. You don't have to carry it alone. But I do have to carry it. That's what being with you means. It means sharing the weight of your world, even the parts I don't want to look at too closely. Adrian was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, what if we made a different choice? What do you mean? I mean, what if I stepped back from some of this, found people I trust to handle the day-to-day operations, moved away from the front lines? I can't leave this life entirely. I have too many obligations, too many people depending on me. But I could create distance. Make it so you're not constantly exposed to the worst of it. Emily stared at him. You'd do that? I'd try. For you, I'd try. He cupped her face in his hands. I can't promise I'll become someone else. Can't promise there won't be nights like tonight, but I can promise to build a life where those nights are the exception instead of the rule, where you don't have to choose between loving me and losing yourself. And if it doesn't work, if you can't step back as much as you think, then we figure it out, together, the same way we've figured out everything else. Adrian's smile was crooked, uncertain in a way she'd never seen from him. I don't have all the answers, Emily. I'm making this up as I go, same as you, but I know I want to try. If you're willing to meet me halfway. Emily thought about the woman she'd been 3 weeks ago. Small, invisible, convinced she deserved to be forgotten. She thought about the woman she'd become. Stronger, braver, still figuring out where the boundaries were but no longer afraid to push against them. And she thought about the woman she could be if she stayed, if she chose this, if she built a life alongside someone who'd seen her when she was nothing and taught her how to be something. It wouldn't be easy. Would probably be the hardest thing she'd ever done. But standing here in Adrian's arms, feeling the weight of his attention like something solid and real, Emily realized she'd already made her choice. She'd made it the moment she'd run toward the warehouse instead of away from it. Okay, she said. Let's try. The relief in Adrian's expression was so profound it almost broke her. He kissed her again, slower this time, and Emily let herself fall into it. Let herself imagine a future that wasn't written yet, that they'd have to build piece by piece. It wouldn't look like the fairy tale she'd imagined with Nathaniel. Wouldn't be safe or predictable or anything she could explain to her friends. But it would be hers. Theirs. Something real instead of something performed. And maybe that was enough. The next 3 months proved that nothing worthwhile came easily. Calabrese reached out 4 days after the warehouse confrontation, exactly as Adrian predicted. The negotiations took 2 weeks and involved more lawyers than Emily thought necessary for what was essentially a criminal treaty, but eventually terms were agreed upon. Calabrese kept his territory, Adrian kept his, and Emily was formally declared off-limits as leverage. It was documented, witnessed, and backed by enough mutual deterrence that both sides trusted it would hold, at least for now. Adrian kept his promise about stepping back. He promoted Marco to handle day-to-day operations, brought in additional people he trusted for the riskier aspects of the business, and started spending more time on the legitimate ventures that didn't require violence to maintain. It wasn't a clean break. There were still nights when he came home tense and quiet, still phone calls in Italian that Emily learned not to ask about, but it was progress. Emily kept her promise too. She found a new job at a nonprofit that worked with domestic violence survivors, using her legal background to help people navigate systems that had failed them. It was harder than her old paralegal position, paid less, but it felt real in a way that filing paperwork never had. She was helping people who'd been made invisible by circumstances they couldn't control. She understood them in a way she never could have before meeting Adrian. She moved into the penthouse officially after 6 weeks. Claudia accepted this development with her usual professional neutrality, though Emily caught her smiling once when Emily successfully navigated a dinner party full of Adrian's business associates without looking terrified. Maya remained skeptical but supportive, which Emily appreciated. She'd told her best friend an edited version of events. Met someone, things move fast, he's got a complicated job, but we're making it work. Maya had taken one look at Emily's face when she talked about Adrian and stopped asking too many questions. Some truths were better left unspoken. The grandmother's ring stayed in its velvet box on Emily's dresser. She'd tried to return it to Adrian multiple times, but he always refused. It was never about the ring, he'd said the last time she brought it up. Keep it. Give it to our daughter someday. The casual mention of a future that included children had stolen Emily's breath. They hadn't talked about that kind of long-term planning, hadn't discussed marriage or family, or anything beyond making it through each day without destroying each other. But the possibility was there now, spoken into existence. 3 months after the warehouse, Emily stood in front of the mirror in what had been the guest suite and was now just her bedroom. Their bedroom, technically, though Adrian still kept his own space for nights when insomnia made sharing a bed impossible. She was wearing another dress Adrian had commissioned, this one emerald green, preparing for another society event she didn't particularly want to attend. But this time, it wasn't about proving anything. It was just part of the life she'd chosen. Adrian appeared in the doorway, already dressed in a tuxedo, looking unfairly good. "You ready?" he asked. Emily turned away from the mirror. "Do I have to be?" "Unfortunately, yes. This is the mayor's fundraiser. If we don't show, people notice. And we care what people notice because? Because part of my legitimate business involves staying on good terms with people who have the power to make my life difficult." Adrian crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. "But if you really don't want to go, we'll send our regrets and stay home." Emily considered it. She could text Maya, order takeout, spend the evening on the couch watching bad television with a man who'd built an empire on fear but looked at her like she was something precious. It sounded infinitely better than making small talk with politicians and their spouses. But she'd learned something over the past 3 months. Sometimes the hard choice was the right choice. Sometimes showing up mattered, even when you didn't want to. "No, we should go," she said. "But you're buying me expensive wine to make it tolerable." "Deal." They were halfway to the door when Emily stopped. "Adrian?" "Yeah?" "Thank you. For seeing me when I was invisible. For teaching me how to be strong. For loving me even when I'm making terrible decisions that put us both in danger." Adrian pulled her back against him, his arms wrapping around her waist. Thank you for being brave enough to walk into my office with that ridiculous ring, for being stubborn enough to stay when I tried to push you away, for loving me despite everything you know about what I've done." Emily turned in his arms, went up on her toes, and kissed him. When they broke apart, she said, "We're a mess, aren't we?" "Completely. But we're our mess. I can live with that." "Good, because you're stuck with me now." They left the penthouse together, Adrian's hand at the small of Emily's back, and headed toward another evening of performance and pretense. But this time, Emily wasn't pretending. She was exactly who she was, strong and stubborn, and still figuring out how to exist in a world that had almost destroyed her. She'd survived Nathaniel's rejection. She'd survived her own desperation. She'd survived stepping into Adrian Moretti's world and discovering that the cost of love was sometimes violence, sometimes fear, sometimes choices that kept her up at night. But she'd also discovered that she was capable of more than she'd ever imagined, that being seen was worth the risk of being hurt, that loving someone meant accepting all of them, even the parts that scared you. The fundraiser was exactly as boring as Emily expected. Politicians gave speeches about things they'd never follow through on. Donors wrote checks they'd use as tax deductions. And everyone pretended they were there because they cared instead of because being seen mattered more than being genuine. Emily made it through 2 hours of small talk before she needed air. She excused herself from a conversation with a city councilman who kept touching her arm while talking and slipped out onto the terrace where the early autumn air was cool enough to clear her head. She wasn't alone long. "Emily Carter." She turned and found Nathaniel standing a few feet away, drink in hand, looking exactly as she remembered. Still handsome, still polished, still completely uninteresting. "Nathaniel," she said evenly, "how's married life?" "Good, fine, the usual." He moved closer, his expression somewhere between curious and concerned. "I heard you've been seeing Adrian Moretti. Is that true?" "It is." "Emily, I don't know if that's a good idea. The man has a reputation. I know his reputation. I know exactly who he is." Emily met Nathaniel's eyes without flinching. "And I chose him anyway. Same way your wife chose you, I imagine. We all make decisions about what we're willing to live with." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "I worry about you." "You lost the right to worry about me when you ended our engagement to marry someone more politically useful. But I appreciate the concern." Emily started to walk past him, then stopped. "Actually, no. I don't appreciate it. You don't get to act like you care now that I've moved on. You don't get to question my choices or imply I'm making mistakes just because I'm with someone you disapprove of. I'm happy, Nathaniel. For the first time in years, I'm actually happy. And if you can't be glad for me, then at least have the decency to leave me alone." She didn't wait for his response. Just walked back inside, found Adrian talking with the mayor, and slipped her hand into his. He glanced at her, a question in his eyes. "Ready to leave?" he murmured. "More than ready." They made their excuses and left within 10 minutes. The drive back to this penthouse was quiet, comfortable, Emily's hand resting on Adrian's thigh while he drove through streets that had become familiar. This was her city now, her life, her choice. "Nathaniel was there," Emily said as they pulled into the underground garage. "I know, I saw him watching you." "Does it bother you that he's my ex?" Adrian killed the engine and turned to look at her. "Should it?" "I don't know, some people would be bothered." "I'm not some people, and you're not with him anymore, you're with me. That's all that matters." He leaned across the console and kissed her softly. "Besides, I think we both know you traded up." Emily laughed, real laughter that came from somewhere deep and genuine. "Yeah, I really did." They went upstairs together, shed the formal clothes in favor of comfortable ones, and ended up on the couch with wine and takeout from the Thai place down the street that Adrian claimed made the best pad Thai in the city. It was domestic and normal and completely at odds with the violence that had brought them together. But that was the thing about building a life with someone. It wasn't all danger and drama. Most of it was just this: quiet evenings, shared meals, the comfortable silence of two people who'd chosen each other despite everything. "I've been thinking," Adrian said around a mouthful of noodles. About what happens next, long term." He set his food down and looked at her seriously. "I want you to marry me." Emily's heart stopped. "What?" Not now, not next month or even next year, but eventually, when we're both ready, I want you to marry me. I want to build a life that's ours. Have kids if you want them. Create something that isn't built on fear or violence or any of the shit that defined my life before I met you. Adrian, I know it's a lot to think about. I know we're still figuring this out, but I need you to know that when I look at the future, you're in it. Always. And if that scares you, if that's too much pressure, tell me now and I'll back off. But if there's even a chance you might want the same thing, I want to know. Emily set down her own food, her hands shaking slightly. She thought about the life she'd imagined with Nathaniel, safe, predictable, suffocating. She thought about the life she was building with Adrian, dangerous, uncertain, real. She thought about the woman she'd been, and the woman she was becoming, and the woman she might be 5 years from now if she kept choosing this. I want the same thing, she said quietly. I want to marry you. I want to build a life together. I want all of it, even the scary parts. Adrian's smile was blinding. He pulled her into his lap, kissing her until they were both breathless, and the Thai food was definitely getting cold. We're going to make so many mistakes, he said against her mouth. Probably. We're going to fight and scare each other and wonder if we're doing the right thing. Almost certainly. But we're going to do it together. Yeah, Emily said, threading her fingers through his hair. Together. They didn't set a date that night, didn't make elaborate plans or discuss logistics. They just existed in the possibility of a future that belonged to them, built on choices they'd made and kept making every single day. 6 months later, Adrian proposed officially, not with the grandmother's ring, which stayed in its velvet box as a reminder of where they'd started, but with something new. Something that represented what they were building rather than what they'd survived. Emily said yes. They married a year after that in a small ceremony with only the people who mattered. No politicians, no society guests, no one they needed to perform for. Just Marco and Sophia and Claudia and Maya and a handful of others who'd become family. It wasn't perfect. Emily still had nightmares sometimes about the warehouse, about Danny's gun, about all the ways things could have gone wrong. Adrian still carried violence with him, still made choices Emily didn't always agree with, still operated in a world that demanded moral compromises she was learning to accept. But they were honest with each other. They fought when they needed to fight, apologized when they were wrong, and kept choosing each other even when it would have been easier to walk away. 2 years after their wedding, Emily stood in what had been the guest suite and was now a nursery, holding their daughter, Isabella, named after Adrian's grandmother, and marveled at how far she'd come from the woman who'd walked into the Crimson Lounge with a desperate plan. Adrian appeared in his doorway, looking exhausted and happy in equal measure. "She asleep?" he asked quietly. "Finally, I think she inherited your stubbornness and your determination. We're in trouble." He crossed the room and wrapped his arms around both of them. "How are you doing?" "Tired, sore, completely in love with this tiny human who won't let me sleep." Emily looked up at him. "How are you doing?" "Terrified I'm going to mess this up. Grateful you're here to make sure I don't." Adrian kissed the top of Isabella's head, then Emily's forehead. "Thank you." "For what?" "For seeing something in me worth saving. For being brave enough to stay when I tried to push you away. For building this with me." His voice cracked slightly. "For making me believe I could be more than what I was." Emily shifted carefully, mindful of the sleeping baby in her arms, and kissed him. "We saved each other. That's how this works." They stood like that in the nursery, bathed in soft light from the lamp they kept burning low, and Emily thought about the ring she'd tried to trade for dignity, about the man who'd seen past her desperation to the strength underneath, about the choices that had led her here, to this moment, to this life she never could have imagined. It wasn't the fairy tale she'd once wanted. It was better. It was real. And 3 weeks from now, when Emily found the velvet box on Isabella's dresser, with a note in Adrian's handwriting, for when she's old enough to understand what it means to choose your own path, she'd cry happy tears and know that everything they'd survived had been worth it, because they'd built something that couldn't be destroyed by violence or fear or the weight of their pasts. They'd built something that belonged to them, to their daughter, to the future they were creating one choice at a time. They'd built a home. And Emily Carter, who'd once been invisible, who'd once thought she deserved to be forgotten, stood in that home with the family she'd chosen and felt finally completely seen.